The Dam Battlegrounds isn't just another contested zone in the Ark Raiders universe. It's a place where the last remnants of organized human resistance made their final stand against mechanical invaders that fundamentally changed how we understand this war. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Let me take you back to how this all started, because the dam wasn't always a battleground. It was once called the Henriksen Hydroelectric Facility, a massive infrastructure project that powered 3 entire districts in what used to be Northern Europe. The dam stood over 400 feet tall, its concrete walls thick enough to withstand a direct missile strike. Or so the engineers thought, back when missiles were the worst thing humanity had to worry about. The facility employed over 2,000 workers at its peak, maintaining the turbines, managing the power grid, and ensuring millions of people had electricity flowing to their homes. It was boring work, steady work, the kind of job you could retire from. Then the Ark Invasion happened, and boring became a luxury no one could afford anymore. The first Ark machines appeared in the skies without warning, without declaration, without any attempt at communication. They simply arrived and began their systematic dismantling of human civilization. Cities fell within weeks, military installations were torn apart like paper, and the governments that once seemed so permanent collapsed into dust. But here's what most people don't know about the early days. The Ark machines weren't just destroying everything in sight. They were selective, methodical, targeting specific infrastructure first. Power plants, water treatment facilities, communication hubs, anything that kept modern society functioning. The Henriksen Dam should have been hit in those first waves, but it wasn't. For 3 months, while the world burned around it, the dam kept running, kept generating power, kept its lights on like a beacon in the growing darkness. Commander Sarah Vex was the one who figured out why. She'd been a structural engineer before the invasion, worked on dam projects across Scandinavia, knew these systems inside and out. When the Ark machines finally started moving toward Henriksen, she was part of a refugee group that had sought shelter in the facility's lower maintenance levels. There were maybe 300 people there at first, families mostly, workers who'd stayed behind when the evacuation orders came because they had nowhere else to go. Vex noticed something the others missed. The Ark machines would approach the dam's perimeter, scan it with those blue light beams they use, and then pull back. Not retreat exactly, more like they were waiting. She spent 2 weeks studying their patterns, watching through the facility's security cameras that somehow still worked, mapping their movements on paper because all the computers had been fried by electromagnetic pulses. What she discovered changed everything. The Ark machines needed the dam intact. They weren't avoiding it out of some glitch or oversight. They were protecting it. Vex realized the machines were building something massive about 40 kilometers north, some kind of processing facility that required enormous amounts of power. The Ark had their own generators, of course, but they were consuming energy faster than they could produce it. The Rixen Dam was the perfect solution, already built, already functional, ready to be integrated into their network. But here's the twist that Vex understood, and the machines apparently didn't. The dam's power output could be controlled, regulated, even weaponized if you knew what you were doing. And Vex knew exactly what she was doing. She gathered the refugees, explained her theory, laid out a plan that sounded completely insane. Instead of running from the dam, they were going to fortify it, turn it into a resistant stronghold, and use the one thing the Ark machines wanted as leverage against them. Most people thought she'd lost her mind. These were families with children, elderly folks, injured survivors who'd barely escaped the cities. They weren't soldiers, weren't trained fighters, weren't prepared for war. But Vex had a gift for making people believe in possibilities they couldn't see. She spoke about the dam not as a target, but as a weapon, not as a place to hide, but as a place to strike back. Slowly, people started to listen. The transformation of Henriksen Dam into what would become known as the Dam Battlegrounds took 4 months of brutal, exhausting work. They fortified the exterior walls using scrap metal from abandoned vehicles, reinforced the access points with concrete they mixed themselves, set up firing positions along the upper walkways. The facility's massive turbine halls became living quarters. The control rooms turned into command centers. The maintenance tunnels evolved into supply routes and escape passages. Vex organized everyone by skill set, putting engineers on defensive systems, mechanics on weapon fabrication, medics on triage protocols. Even the kids had jobs, running messages between sections, sorting salvaged materials, keeping watch on the security monitors. But fortifying a position means nothing if you can't defend it. And that's where Marcus Chen entered the picture. Chen had been a military contractor before the invasion, specialized in asymmetric warfare, the kind of fighting where you're always outgunned and outmanned, but you win anyway through tactics and terrain advantage. He arrived at the dam with a group of 12 former soldiers, all of them survivors from units that had been annihilated in the early battles. Chen took one look at Vex's fortifications and started laughing. Not because they were bad, but because they were perfect. She'd built a defensive position that turned every Ark advantage into a disadvantage. The machines relied on aerial superiority, but the dam's architecture created narrow approach vectors. They used overwhelming numbers, but the facility's choke points would funnel them into kill zones. They had better weapons, better armor, better everything, but Vex had built a maze that negated all of it. Chen and Vex became the dual commanders of what they started calling the Dam Resistance. She handled logistics, infrastructure, and long-term planning. He managed combat operations, training, and tactical decisions. Together, they created something that hadn't existed since the invasion began, an organized human military force that could actually fight back. Word spread fast in those days. Survivors had networks, ways of communicating that the Ark machines hadn't figured out how to intercept yet. Within 6 months, the Dam Battlegrounds went from 300 refugees to over 2,000 resistance fighters. People came from everywhere, walked hundreds of miles through Ark-controlled territory just for the chance to be part of something that wasn't just running and hiding. The first real battle happened on a Tuesday morning in what used to be October, though by then most people had stopped tracking months and just counted days since the invasion. An Ark scouting force approached the dam, 6 of those spider-like machines they use for reconnaissance, each one the size of a truck, with sensors that could detect human heat signatures from a kilometer away. Chen had prepared for this moment, drilled his people relentlessly on the tactics they'd need. The scouts entered the kill zone right on schedule, exactly where Vex's calculations said they would. The resistance opened fire with salvaged weapons, homemade explosives, even modified construction equipment they'd turned into makeshift artillery. 4 of the 6 scouts went down in the first volley. The other 2 retreated, which is exactly what Chen wanted them to do. Let the machines report back. Let them know the dam was defended. Let them send a bigger force. Because Chen had a theory he needed to test. He believed the Ark machines operated on probability matrices, constantly calculating the most efficient path to their objectives. If the dam looked too costly to take, they might leave it alone, focus on easier targets. But if it looked like a challenge they could overcome with acceptable losses, they'd commit to a full assault. Chen wanted that assault, needed it actually, because he'd realized something crucial. The resistance couldn't win by playing defense forever. They needed to make the Ark machines bleed, needed to prove that humanity could still fight back, still inflict damage. The scout battle was just the opening move. 3 days later, the Ark sent their response. 40 combat units, a mix of those spider scouts and the heavier bipedal hunters that could tear through reinforced concrete. They hit the dam at dawn, coming from 3 directions simultaneously in a coordinated assault that should have overwhelmed the defenses. Should have, but didn't. Vex had rigged the approach routes with pressure sensors that triggered cascading traps, collapsing sections of the access road, creating artificial bottlenecks that forced the machines into predetermined paths. Chen's fighters were positioned perfectly, using the dam's elevation to rain fire down on the Ark units as they struggled through the obstacles. The battle lasted 6 hours, and when it ended, 32 Ark machines lay destroyed or disabled around the perimeter. The resistance lost 47 people, each death hitting hard, but they'd proven something vital: they could win. That victory changed everything. The Dam Battlegrounds became a symbol, proof that the Ark Invasion wasn't unstoppable. Resistance cells across the continent started coordinating with Vex and Chen, sharing intelligence, requesting tactical advice, sending fighters to train at the dam. The population swelled to over 5,000, straining resources but bringing incredible talent. Scientists who'd escaped the cities, engineers who understood Ark technology, hackers who could sometimes intercept machine communications. The dam evolved from a fortified position into humanity's first real military base in the post-invasion world. But the Ark machines were learning too, adapting their tactics with each engagement. They stopped using predictable assault patterns, started employing electronic warfare that disrupted human communications, began sending infiltrator units that could bypass the outer defenses. The battles became more frequent, more intense, grinding down the resistance through sheer attrition. Vex and Chen both knew they couldn't sustain this forever. The dam was finite, the supplies were finite, the people were finite. They needed a way to change the equation, to shift from defensive survival to offensive action. The answer came from the most unexpected source, a 17-year-old kid named David Park, who'd been working in the dam's monitoring station. Park was obsessed with the Ark machines, spent every spare moment studying footage of them, analyzing their behavior patterns, trying to understand how they thought. One night, he came to Vex with a theory that sounded completely absurd. He believed the Ark machines weren't controlled by individual AI. They were nodes in a distributed network, all connected to regional command hubs that coordinated their actions. Take out a hub, and you'd cripple every machine in that sector. Vex asked him how he knew this. Park showed her 3 months of behavioral analysis, pattern recognition data that he'd compiled by hand because the computers couldn't process it. The kid was right. Vex could see it in the data. The machines operated in clusters, their actions too synchronized to be independent. Chen immediately saw the strategic implications. If they could locate and destroy an Ark command hub, they'd create a dead zone where the machines couldn't operate effectively. The resistance could expand, claim territory, build more bases. It would change the entire war from desperate defense to actual counter-offensive. The problem was finding these hubs. The Ark machines didn't exactly advertise their locations. Park had an idea about that too. He'd noticed that certain machines had stronger signal emissions, acted as relay points between the regular units and something further away. Track those relay machines back to their source, and you'd find the hub. Vex authorized a reconnaissance mission, something they'd never attempted before. Chen handpicked a team of 20 fighters, the best scouts and trackers they had. The plan was simple in concept, impossible in execution. Follow an Ark relay machine back to its hub, map the location, return with intelligence. Don't engage, don't get detected, just observe and report. The team left at night, moving through Ark-controlled territory using every stealth technique Chen had taught them. They were gone for 11 days, and when they came back, only 6 of them had survived. But they'd found it. The Ark command hub was located in what used to be an industrial complex about 60 kilometers from the dam. The facility was massive, protected by hundreds of combat units, surrounded by sensor arrays that could detect anything larger than a rat. A direct assault would be suicide. Chen knew that immediately. But Vex was already working through the engineering problem, calculating vectors and blast radii, figuring out if there was any possible way to destroy the hub without getting close to it. The answer was the dam itself, specifically the dam's power generation system. If they could overload the electrical grid, create a massive power surge, they could theoretically channel it through the Ark machine's own network, use their connectivity as a weapon against them. It was incredibly risky, might destroy the dam's systems, might not even work, but it was the only option that didn't require a suicidal frontal assault. Preparation took 3 weeks. Vex and her engineering team rebuilt entire sections of the dam's power distribution network, installing surge capacitors they fabricated from salvaged materials, rerouting circuits to handle loads they were never designed for. Park worked on the signal side, figuring out how to hack into the Ark network long enough to direct the surge toward the command hub. Chen prepared for the worst-case scenario, positioning fighters to defend the dam against the inevitable counterattack that would come when the Ark machines realized what was happening. Everyone knew this was an all-or-nothing gambit. If it failed, the Ark would crush them. If it succeeded, they'd strike the first major blow against the invasion. The attack launched on what they designated as Day Zero for the counter-offensive. Vex initiated the power surge at exactly 0400 hours, routing every watt the dam could generate through the modified systems. Park opened the connection to the Ark network, a digital backdoor he'd discovered weeks earlier, and directed the surge toward the command hub. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. The dam's turbines screamed with overload, lights flickered across the facility, and everyone held their breath. Then the sky 60 kilometers away lit up like a second sun, a massive electromagnetic pulse that painted the clouds purple and white, and every Ark machine within a 100-kilometer radius just stopped. Complete shutdown, simultaneous across hundreds of units. The ones near the dam collapsed mid-step. The flyers dropped from the sky. Even the small scouts just powered down where they stood. The silence was deafening. After months of constant machine noise, the sudden absence of it felt wrong, impossible. For about 10 minutes, people just stared, unable to process what they'd accomplished. Then the celebration started, and for the first time since the invasion began, humanity had something to celebrate. They'd struck back. They'd hurt the Ark. They'd proven the machines could be beaten. The victory lasted exactly 6 hours. That's when the revenge came. The Ark responded to the hub's destruction by redirecting forces through 3 adjacent sectors. Over 1,000 combat units converging on the dam in a coordinated assault unlike anything they'd deployed before. Chen saw them coming on the long-range sensors, a mechanical tide that would overwhelm every defense they had. He called for evacuation, started organizing the retreat protocols they'd prepared for exactly this scenario. But Vex refused to leave, argued that the dam was too valuable, that they could hold if they just repositioned, reinforced, adapted. Chen knew better, knew that sometimes you win by knowing when to walk away. The argument between them lasted maybe 5 minutes before the first Ark machines reached the perimeter. Then there was no more time for debate, only survival. Chen ordered the evacuation anyway, started moving civilians through the maintenance tunnels toward the emergency exit points. Vex coordinated a fighting retreat, using every trick, every trap, every defensive measure they'd built over the past year. The resistance fighters held the line section by section, level by level, buying time with their lives for the non-combatants to escape. The battle turned the dam into a war zone. Explosions tore through the turbine halls, the control rooms burned, the walls that had protected them for so long crumbled under sustained Ark weapons fire. David Park died in the 3rd hour of the battle, crushed when a ceiling collapsed during an Ark artillery strike. He'd refused to evacuate, stayed at his monitoring station trying to coordinate defensive positions until the very end. Marcus Chen held the main entrance for 4 hours with 50 fighters, a last stand that bought enough time for over 3,000 people to escape through the tunnels. When ammunition ran out, he ordered his people to fall back, but stayed behind himself, rigged the entire entrance with every explosive they had left, and brought it down on top of an Ark assault wave. They never found his body. Sarah Vex was the last person to leave the Dam Battlegrounds. She walked through the ruins one final time, past the bodies of friends and strangers who'd believed in her vision, past the smouldering wreckage of machines they'd destroyed, past the home they'd built in the middle of hell. Before she left, she activated the dam's self-destruct sequence, a failsafe she'd installed months earlier, just in case. If the Ark wanted the dam so badly, they could have it, but it wouldn't do them any good. The charges detonated 5 minutes after she cleared the blast zone, collapsing the entire structure into the reservoir, creating a flood that washed away everything, human and machine alike. The survivors, about 2,800 of them, scattered into the wilderness using escape routes Chen had mapped during his early reconnaissance. They split into smaller groups, each heading toward different resistance cells that had sprung up inspired by the Dam Battlegrounds example. Vex led one group toward the mountains, where intelligence suggested another major settlement existed. She carried with her the complete tactical data from every battle they'd fought, every lesson they'd learned, every innovation they'd developed. The Dam Battlegrounds might be gone, but the knowledge survived, the tactics survived, the proof that humans could fight back survived. Over the following months, Vex's group made contact with 7 other resistance cells, sharing what they'd learned at the dam. The tactics spread like wildfire across the human remnant, fortified positions, coordinated assaults, hub targeting strategies. The Ark Invasion had seemed unstoppable because humanity fought them like a conventional war. But the Dam Battlegrounds proved that wasn't necessary. You didn't need to match the Ark's strength. You needed to exploit their weaknesses, turn their advantages against them, make every victory cost them more than they could afford. Chen's tactical doctrine became the foundation of organized resistance. Vex's engineering solutions were replicated at a dozen other facilities. Park's network analysis opened up an entirely new front in the electronic warfare domain. But here's what most people don't understand about the Dam Battlegrounds, what really made it matter. It wasn't about the military victories, or the destroyed machines, or even the command hub they took offline. It was about what it represented. For the first time since the Ark arrived, humans stopped running and stood their ground. For the first time, people believed they could survive this, not just hide and wait for extinction, but actually fight back and win. The dam became a story that spread through every refugee camp, every resistance cell, every group of survivors huddled in bunkers, wondering if humanity had a future. The story said, yes, we do, because we did this, and we can do it again. The Ark machines eventually built a new command hub to replace the one the dam resistance destroyed. They adapted their network protocols to prevent future surges, upgraded their defenses, implemented new tactics designed to counter everything Vex and Chen had developed. But by then it was too late. The resistance had momentum, had hope, had a blueprint for fighting back. The Dam Battlegrounds lasted less than a year as a physical location, but its legacy shaped the entire course of the war that followed. Sarah Vex continued leading resistance operations for another 3 years before she was killed in an Ark ambush during a supply run. By then, she'd trained over 500 fighters in her methods, established a network of fortified positions across northern Europe, and written the tactical manual that became standard reading for every resistance commander. When she died, her people didn't mourn for long. They honored her by continuing the fight, exactly as she'd taught them. The site where the Henriksen Dam once stood is still there, somewhere under the water and rubble, a monument to everything that happened. The Ark machines never tried to rebuild it. Maybe they learned their lesson about creating targets too valuable to abandon. Or maybe they just moved on to other objectives in their endless, incomprehensible war. Humans don't go there anymore either. The area's too dangerous, too heavily patrolled, too saturated with Ark presence. But sometimes in resistance camps, when veterans tell stories about the early days of the war, someone will mention the Dam Battlegrounds and everyone gets quiet, respectful, acknowledging what was accomplished there and what it cost. Because that's the real story of the Dam Battlegrounds. Not just what happened, but what it meant. 300 refugees became 2,000 fighters. A hydroelectric facility became a symbol of resistance. And for one brief moment, humanity proved that the Ark Invasion could bleed. The unknown Ark territory wasn't unknown because people didn't know about it. It was unknown because the full story never got told. The complete picture of how ordinary people became extraordinary soldiers, how desperation became determination, how a dam became a battlefield that changed the war. The geographical designation of the Dam Battlegrounds as unknown Ark territory came from military cartographers who were trying to map out the invasion zones in those chaotic early years. They marked certain areas with specific codes based on Ark activity levels, strategic value, and human survivability rates. Most territories got straightforward classifications: red zones for heavy Ark presence, yellow for contested areas, green for the few places humans still controlled. But the Dam region broke their classification system because it didn't fit any category they'd created. It had massive Ark presence, but also significant human resistance. It was strategically critical, but constantly changing hands. It was simultaneously a death trap and a sanctuary depending on which week you looked at it. So the cartographers just marked it unknown and moved on, never realizing that name would stick, would become part of the legend. What made the territory truly unknown wasn't the classification, though. It was what happened in the months after the dam fell. The Ark machines should have consolidated control immediately, should have moved in with overwhelming force and turned the entire region into a machine stronghold. They didn't. Instead, something weird started happening. The Ark units in that area began exhibiting behavioral anomalies that the resistance couldn't explain. Machines would patrol the same routes repeatedly, without purpose, would ignore human survivors passing right in front of them, would sometimes just stop functioning for hours before reactivating. The pattern was so strange, the Vex, before she died, sent multiple reconnaissance teams to investigate what was going on. Those teams discovered something that changed how the Resistance understood Ark technology. The electromagnetic pulse that destroyed the command hub hadn't just knocked out the machines, it had damaged something fundamental in the Ark network architecture for that entire region. The machines still functioned, but they were operating on corrupted programming, following orders from a hub that no longer existed, trying to complete objectives that made no sense. It was like watching soldiers continue fighting a battle that had already ended, going through the motions without understanding why. The Resistance realized they'd accidentally created a dead zone, not in the sense that machines didn't operate there, but that they operated incorrectly, inefficiently, broken. This discovery led to one of the most important strategic shifts in the entire war. If an electromagnetic surge could corrupt Ark programming on a regional scale, then maybe that was a weapon more valuable than any conventional military strike. Resistance engineers started working on portable EMP devices, smaller versions of what Vex had built into the dam's power systems. The first prototypes were crude, barely worked, sometimes fried human equipment as badly as they damaged Ark machines. But over time they improved, refined, became actual tactical tools that Resistance fighters could deploy in the field. The unknown Ark territory became a testing ground for these new weapons. Small Resistance teams would infiltrate the region, plant EMP charges near Ark patrol routes, detonate them, and observe the results. They learned that different types of machines had different vulnerabilities, that the timing of the pulse mattered as much as its strength, that you could sometimes reprogram damaged machines if you knew the right techniques. This last discovery was huge because it meant the Resistance could potentially turn Ark technology against itself, use captured and reprogram machines as weapons or infiltration tools. A woman named Jennifer Cross led most of these experimental operations. She'd been a software engineer before the invasion, worked on neural network architecture for autonomous vehicles, which turned out to be surprisingly relevant to understanding Ark machine logic. Cross had survived the Dam Battlegrounds evacuation and spent the following year obsessed with understanding how the machines thought, how their decision trees worked, how they prioritized targets and assessed threats. She was the first person to successfully reprogram a captured Ark scout, turning it into a remote-controlled spy that could move through Ark-controlled territory without triggering alarms. The process was incredibly dangerous and failed more often than it succeeded. Ark machines had built-in security protocols that would destroy their core systems if they detected tampering. Cross lost 3 fingers on her left hand when one of her early attempts triggered a thermal failsafe that superheated the machine's internal components. But she kept pushing, kept experimenting, kept finding new ways to exploit the vulnerabilities that the dam's electromagnetic surge had exposed. Within 18 months, she trained over 100 Resistance technicians in her methods, created a whole new branch of Resistance warfare that focused on technological subversion rather than direct combat. The Ark machines eventually figured out what was happening and started deploying countermeasures. They upgraded their shielding against electromagnetic pulses, implemented new security protocols that made reprogramming exponentially harder, began hunting Resistance tech teams with the same priority they gave to major military threats. The cat and mouse game between Cross's teams and the Ark security systems became its own miniature war within the larger conflict. Every time the Resistance developed a new technique, the Ark adapted, and every time the Ark adapted, the Resistance found a new exploit to target. But the unknown Ark territory remained strange, different from anywhere else the machines operated. Even with their upgrades and countermeasures, the Ark never fully recovered control of that region. The damaged network architecture created permanent blind spots in their sensor coverage, dead zones where their command and control systems didn't function properly. The Resistance exploited these gaps ruthlessly, building hidden outposts in places the machines couldn't effectively monitor, creating supply routes through corridors the Ark couldn't properly guard, establishing a shadow infrastructure right under the machines' noses. One of these outposts became particularly important, a facility built into an abandoned mining complex about 30 kilometers from where the dam used to stand. The mines went deep, hundreds of meters underground, far enough that Ark sensors couldn't penetrate the rock. Resistance fighters excavated additional tunnels, connected multiple mine shafts into a sprawling subterranean base that could house over 1,000 people. They called it Undermount, and it became the spiritual successor to the Dam Battlegrounds, a fortified position where the resistance could organize, train, and launch operations. Undermount's commander was a man named Thomas Reeves, who'd served under Marcus Chen during the dam's final days. Reeves had learned everything Chen taught about defensive tactics and asymmetric warfare, but he added his own innovations based on the underground environment. Where the dam had used elevation and choke points, Undermount used depth and darkness. The mines became a three-dimensional maze that only humans could navigate effectively. Ark machines struggled with the tight passages, the unstable floors, the complete absence of GPS signals that they relied on for coordination. Reeves turned those disadvantages into weapons, building kill zones in collapsed tunnels, setting up ambush points in vertical shafts, creating a defensive network that made the mines nearly impregnable. The base attracted fighters from across the region, people who'd heard the stories about the Dam Battlegrounds and wanted to be part of something similar. But it also attracted civilians who just needed somewhere safe to live. Families with children, elderly survivors who couldn't keep running anymore, injured people who required long-term medical care. Undermount evolved into more than a military installation. It became a community, a place where people could pretend that normal life still existed. They set up schools in the deeper chambers, organized a medical clinic, even maintained a small hydroponic farm that grew vegetables in artificial light. It wasn't much, wasn't anywhere close to what the world used to be, but it was something, and something was infinitely better than nothing. The farms were Jennifer Cross's idea, actually. She joined Undermount's command staff after her tech teams took too many losses, operating in the open. Cross realized that the Resistance's biggest vulnerability wasn't military, it was logistical. You could train fighters, scavenge weapons, build fortifications, but you couldn't fight without food, and food was becoming critically scarce. The Ark machines didn't need to defeat humanity in battle, they just needed to wait for starvation to do the work for them. So Cross pivoted her engineering expertise from machines to agriculture, designed the hydroponic systems, figured out how to generate enough power from geothermal sources to keep them running, created a food production system that could sustain Undermount's population indefinitely. This might seem like a small thing compared to the battles and the technology and the dramatic military operations, but it wasn't. Food security meant Undermount could survive long-term, could grow instead of just persisting, could become a permanent fixture instead of another temporary refuge that would eventually collapse. Other resistance bases started adopting Cross's agricultural designs, building their own farms, achieving their own food independence. For the first time since the invasion, humans weren't just scavenging the ruins of the old world, they were building something new, something that could potentially outlast the war. The Ark machines didn't ignore Undermount, but they couldn't effectively attack it. Every assault they launched into the mines ended in disaster, their units getting lost in the tunnels, falling into traps, being picked apart by resistance fighters who knew every passage and ambush point. The machines tried collapsing the mine entrances, burying the base under tons of rock. But Reeves had prepared for that, built multiple concealed access points that the Ark couldn't locate. They tried pumping toxic gas into the tunnels, but the Resistance had installed filtration systems and sealed doors that contained the contamination. They even tried flooding the mines, but the old pump systems still worked, and the Resistance just diverted the water into storage systems they'd built for exactly that scenario. After 2 years of failed assaults, the Ark machines changed tactics. They couldn't take Undermount by force, so they tried to isolate it instead. They established a perimeter around the entire region, thick concentrations of machines that monitored every approach route, intercepted supply convoys, killed anyone trying to reach the base. The siege wasn't about breaking into Undermount, it was about cutting it off from the outside world, turning the base from a resistance stronghold into a prison. No supplies in, no people in, no information in. Just wait for the food to run out, for the equipment to break down, for the hope to die. But they'd underestimated how much the unknown Ark territory's damaged network still hampered their operations. The blind spots in their sensor coverage created gaps in the siege perimeter, narrow corridors that changed position as the network glitched and recovered and glitched again. Resistance scouts learned to predict these gaps, mapped out patterns in the network failures, created timing charts that showed when safe passage might be possible. It was dangerous, required perfect timing and a lot of luck, but it worked often enough to keep Undermount connected to the outside world. Supply runners became some of the most respected people in the Resistance, sprinting through machine-infested territory with nothing but their wits and the knowledge that one mistake meant death. One of these runners was a teenager named Maria Santos, who'd grown up in Undermount after her parents died in the dam evacuation. Santos was 15 when she made her first supply run, carrying medical supplies through an 8-hour journey that should have been impossible. She survived by being small, fast, and absolutely fearless. Where adults would hesitate, Santos would just move, trusting her instincts and the route map she'd memorized. She made over 40 successful runs before the Ark machines finally adapted their patrol patterns enough to close the gap she'd been using. By then, she'd trained 24 other runners in her methods, created a whole network of people who kept Undermount alive through sheer determination and calculated risk-taking. The supply runs brought more than just materials. They brought information, news from other resistance cells, intelligence about Ark movements, updates on the war's progress in distant regions. Undermount became a hub for coordinating resistance operations across the entire unknown Ark territory. Reeves established communication protocols with bases up to 200 kilometers away, started organizing joint operations that could strike multiple Ark targets simultaneously. The machines might have damaged network architecture in this region, but the humans were building their own network, one based on runners and radio relays and good old-fashioned human communication. This coordination led to what became known as the Midnight Offensive, a series of attacks launched across the unknown Ark territory on the same night by 12 different resistance cells. The targets were all Ark relay stations, the infrastructure that the machines used to maintain their network, even in this damaged region. Reeves and the other commanders had identified 37 relay stations through months of reconnaissance, plotted their locations, assessed their defenses, and organized strike teams to hit them all within a 6-hour window. The idea was to overwhelm the Ark's ability to respond, force them to choose which stations to defend, create chaos in their already unstable network. The offensive launched exactly at midnight on what would have been New Year's Eve in the old calendar. Resistance fighters hit 17 relay stations simultaneously, using explosives, EMP weapons, and in some cases just brute force attacks with conventional weapons. The Ark response was exactly what Reeves predicted: confused, uncoordinated, spread too thin to effectively defend everything. By dawn, 2003 relay stations had been destroyed or damaged badly enough to be non-functional. The machine network in the unknown Ark territory didn't collapse completely, but it degraded significantly, creating even more blind spots, more gaps, more opportunities for resistance operations. The Ark retaliation was brutal and indiscriminate. Unable to locate the specific resistance bases that had launched the attacks, the machines just started destroying everything in the region that could potentially harbor humans. Small settlements that had survived through obscurity were burned, refugee camps were massacred, even individual buildings that might shelter someone were systematically demolished. Over 3,000 civilians died in the first week of the retaliation. People who had nothing to do with the Midnight Offensive, but paid the price anyway. The resistance commanders knew this would happen, had factored civilian casualties into their strategic calculations, and that knowledge haunted every single one of them. Thomas Reeves stopped sleeping after the retaliation started. He'd spend nights in Undermount's command center, listening to radio reports of destroyed settlements, counting the dead, calculating whether the relay stations they'd destroyed were worth the lives lost in response. Jennifer Cross found him there one night, staring at a map covered in red marks indicating massacre sites. She didn't offer platitudes or try to make him feel better, just sat down next to him and said that war meant making impossible choices, that every decision cost lives, that the only thing worse than accepting that burden would be refusing to make decisions at all. Reeves asked her how she lived with it, how she functioned knowing that her strategic choices killed people. Cross told him she didn't live with it. She just kept moving forward because stopping meant giving up, and giving up meant everyone died instead of just some. The Midnight Offensive's aftermath marked a turning point in how the resistance operated in the unknown Ark territory. Before, they'd focused on survival, on maintaining their positions, and outlasting the machines. After, they shifted to aggressive expansion, pushing into areas the Ark couldn't properly defend, claiming territory that the damaged network left vulnerable. It was riskier, cost more lives, but it also achieved results that pure defense never could. Within 6 months, the resistance controlled significant portions of the territory, not officially, not openly, but in the practical sense that they could move through areas the machines couldn't effectively patrol. This expansion brought the resistance into contact with groups they hadn't known existed, isolated communities that had survived the invasion through luck and isolation. Some of these communities welcomed the resistance, joined the network, contributed their people and resources to the fight. Others wanted nothing to do with organized warfare, preferred to maintain their isolation, and hoped the machines never found them. The resistance usually respected that choice, didn't force anyone to fight, but also didn't guarantee protection to those who wouldn't contribute to their own defense. Resources were too scarce, fighters too few, to waste on defending people who wouldn't defend themselves. But there were exceptions, situations where the resistance intervened, even when it wasn't strategically optimal. A settlement called Brightwater Valley was one of these. The valley housed about 200 people, mostly families with young children, living in a cluster of farmhouses that had somehow escaped Ark attention for over 3 years. They had no fighters, no weapons, no defensive infrastructure, just farmers trying to grow crops and pretend the world hadn't ended. When Ark machines finally discovered the valley and began their approach, the civilians sent a desperate plea for help to anyone who might be listening. Undermount picked up the transmission, and Reeves faced a decision. The valley had no strategic value, defending it would cost resources and possibly lives, and the civilians hadn't contributed anything to the resistance effort. He sent 50 fighters anyway, along with Jennifer Cross and a team of engineers. They reached Brightwater Valley 6 hours before the Ark machines arrived, barely enough time to set up basic defenses. Cross looked at the farmhouses, the open fields, the complete absence of cover or defensive positions, and told Reeves they couldn't hold this place. He knew that, told her they didn't need to hold it, just needed to buy enough time for evacuation. The civilians didn't want to leave. These were their homes, their farms, their lives. Reeves didn't give them a choice, ordered his fighters to start herding people toward the tree line where transport vehicles waited. Some families cooperated, others had to be physically carried away from their houses. The Ark machines hit Brightwater Valley with overwhelming force, 60 combat units that would have annihilated any conventional defense. But Reeves wasn't trying to win, just trying to slow them down, make them work for every meter. His fighters used hit-and-run tactics, firing from cover and falling back, leaving mines and traps that damaged machines without engaging them directly. Cross deployed every EMP device they had, creating zones of disrupted Ark sensors that bought precious minutes. The battle lasted 4 hours and ended with Brightwater Valley completely destroyed, every building burned, every field scorched. But all 200 civilians made it out alive, evacuated to Undermount, where they'd be safe. That rescue operation became legendary in the resistance, not because of any brilliant tactics or major victory, but because it showed what they were fighting for. Not territory, not strategic advantages, not even defeating the Ark machines necessarily. They were fighting for the right of humans to exist, to live, to have homes and families and futures. Every civilian saved was a victory against the machine's fundamental goal of eradicating humanity. The Brightwater refugees integrated into Undermount's population, brought their agricultural knowledge to Cross's hydroponic systems, contributed to the community in ways that paid back the cost of their rescue 100 times over. Stories like Brightwater spread through the resistance network, inspiring other cells to prioritize civilian protection even when it wasn't strategically optimal. The war wasn't just about killing machines, it was about preserving humanity. And humanity wasn't just the fighters, it was everyone. This philosophy sometimes created tension between purely military commanders who wanted to focus on tactical victories, and leaders like Reeves, who understood that losing the civilians meant losing everything the war was supposed to protect. The unknown Ark territory became a proving ground for these competing philosophies. Some resistance cells operated like military units, focused entirely on combat operations and Ark casualties. Others prioritized civilian welfare, built communities and infrastructure, treated the war as something to survive rather than win. The most successful bases, including Undermount, found a balance between both approaches. They maintained strong defensive and offensive capabilities, but also invested in agriculture, education, medicine, all the things that made life worth living. Jennifer Cross pushed this balance further than anyone else when she proposed something that sounded completely insane to the military-minded commanders. She wanted to build a school, not just basic education for children, but an actual academy that would teach advanced engineering, Ark technology analysis, tactical operations, everything the resistance had learned since the invasion began. Her argument was simple but powerful. The war wasn't going to end quickly. Everyone knew that by now. The children growing up in places like Undermount would be the fighters and leaders of tomorrow, and they needed real training, systematic education, not just whatever random knowledge they could pick up from adults too busy surviving to teach properly. Reeves initially rejected the proposal because it required dedicating significant resources and space to something that wouldn't provide any immediate tactical benefit. But Cross wore him down over weeks of persistent argument, pointing out that Undermount's children were already trying to learn on their own, already experimenting with salvaged Ark technology in dangerous ways because nobody was teaching them proper safety protocols. She showed him a 12-year-old kid who'd nearly blown himself up trying to dismantle a machine power core because he wanted to understand how it worked. That convinced Reeves. Better to channel that curiosity and energy into structured learning than lose kids to preventable accidents. The Undermount Academy started with 40 students and 3 teachers, using a converted storage chamber as a classroom. The curriculum covered basic academics like reading and math, but also specialized subjects that only mattered in the post-invasion world. Ark machine identification and behavioral analysis, electromagnetic warfare principles, fortification engineering, emergency medical procedures, survival tactics for machine-controlled territory. The students ranged from 8 to 17 years old, all of them growing up in a world where knowing the difference between an Ark scout and a hunter could mean life or death. One of those students was Maria Santos, the supply runner who'd made those 40 successful trips through Ark-controlled territory. She was 16 by then, already a veteran by resistance standards, but she wanted to understand the theory behind what she'd been doing instinctively. Santos had survived through pattern recognition and gut instinct, but Cross taught her the engineering principles that explained why those patterns existed, how the Ark network actually functioned, what the machines were trying to accomplish with their patrol routes. That knowledge transformed Santos from a skilled runner into a tactical analyst who could predict Ark movements with frightening accuracy. The academy attracted attention from other resistance bases. Within a year, 5 more schools had opened in different locations across the unknown Ark territory, each one adapting Cross's curriculum to their local needs. Students who excelled in the programs became valuable resources, young people who understood both the old world knowledge preserved by adults and the new reality of fighting machines. Some went into combat roles, becoming scout leaders or tactical specialists. Others focused on engineering, medicine, agriculture. A few even started teaching, passing along what they'd learned to the next wave of students. But education created an unexpected problem. The students started questioning orders, analyzing tactical decisions, pushing back against commanders when they thought strategies were flawed. This drove some of the older resistance leaders crazy. They wanted obedient soldiers who followed orders without debate. Reeves saw it differently. He'd rather have fighters who understood why they were doing something than mindless followers who just executed commands. The pushback meant people were thinking, analyzing, trying to find better solutions. That was exactly what the resistance needed to evolve and adapt as the Ark machines continued upgrading their capabilities. The tension between old-school military hierarchy and the academy-trained generation came to a head during what became known as the Gorman Junction debate. An Ark supply convoy had been spotted moving through a narrow mountain pass, heavily guarded but potentially vulnerable to ambush. The traditional military commanders wanted to hit it with maximum force, overwhelm the guards, and seize whatever the convoy was carrying. But a group of academy students, led by Maria Santos, analyzed the situation and argued that the convoy was a trap, that the Ark had learned enough about resistance tactics to predict exactly this kind of ambush, and had positioned hidden reinforcements to counter it. The commanders dismissed the students' analysis, called it overthinking, said that sometimes you just needed to trust your combat instincts and take the shot. Santos refused to back down, presented data showing how Ark convoy patterns had changed over the past 6 months, how the machines were deliberately creating opportunities that looked appealing but were actually kill zones. She predicted exactly where the hidden reinforcements would be, how many units, what types. The commanders still wanted to proceed with the ambush. Reeves had to make a call: trust experienced fighters who'd survived dozens of operations, or trust a 16-year-old girl with a tablet full of analysis. He sided with Santos, called off the ambush, ordered reconnaissance to verify her predictions. 2 days later, scouts confirmed everything she'd said. The convoy route had Ark hunter units concealed in positions that would have slaughtered any ambush force. If the resistance had attacked, they'd have lost over 100 fighters in minutes. The commanders who'd pushed for the assault were furious at first, embarrassed that a teenager had read the situation better than they had, but most of them came around eventually, recognized that the war was changing, and they needed to change with it. The few who couldn't adapt either retired from command roles or left for other bases where old-school tactics were still valued. The Gorman Junction incident established a new dynamic in Undermount's command structure. Military experience still mattered, combat skills still mattered, but analysis and tactical intelligence became equally important. The academy students weren't just future fighters anymore. They were current assets whose insights could save lives right now. Santos herself became the youngest person ever appointed to Undermount's Tactical Planning Committee, working alongside veterans 3 times her age to develop operations that combined traditional combat expertise with data-driven analysis. This integration of young tactical minds into actual decision-making spread through other resistance bases, creating a generation of hybrid fighter analysts who approached the war differently than their predecessors. They didn't just react to Ark movements, they predicted them, anticipated machine behavior patterns, created plans that accounted for how the Ark would likely respond. It was a more cerebral approach to warfare than the desperate survival tactics of the early invasion years, but it worked. Resistance casualties dropped while successful operations increased. The humans were learning faster than the machines were adapting. The Ark eventually noticed this shift and started deploying countermeasures specifically designed to confuse pattern-based analysis. They introduced randomness into their patrol routes, created fake supply convoys that didn't follow logical patterns, deployed units in configurations that made no tactical sense. It was the machine equivalent of psychological warfare, trying to make the resistance doubt their analytical methods, second-guess their predictions, fall back on pure reaction instead of calculated planning. Some bases did exactly that, abandoned the analytical approach when it started producing bad predictions, reverted to older reactive tactics. Undermount doubled down instead. Jennifer Cross organized a crash course in chaos theory and probabilistic modeling, teaching the tactical analysts how to incorporate randomness into their predictions, how to calculate confidence intervals around their assessments, how to distinguish between genuine pattern changes and deliberate Ark obfuscation. It was harder than the straightforward pattern recognition they'd been using, required more sophisticated mathematical tools and deeper understanding of both Ark behavior and statistical analysis. But the students adapted, pushed themselves to master concepts that university graduate programs used to teach, because their lives and their community depended on getting this right. Maria Santos led the development of a new analytical framework they called probability-weighted tactical assessment. Instead of predicting exactly what the Ark would do, they generated multiple scenarios with different likelihood ratings, developed response plans for each scenario, and built-in decision triggers that would indicate which scenario was actually playing out. It meant more preparation work up front, but it also meant the resistance could respond faster and more effectively when situations developed. The framework became standard across most resistance bases in the unknown Ark territory within 6 months. Another example of how innovations developed in one location could spread through the entire network. The unknown Ark territory's strategic importance grew as these innovations accumulated. What had started as a geographical accident, a region where damaged Ark networks created opportunities, evolved into the Resistance's primary research and development hub. New weapons, new tactics, new organizational structures, most of them originated somewhere in this territory, before spreading to resistance cells across the continent. The machines still controlled most of the land, still had overwhelming force advantage, still outnumbered humans by orders of magnitude. But in this one region, the humans had carved out something approaching parity. Zones where they could operate with reasonable safety, infrastructure that could sustain them long term, capabilities that let them fight back effectively. Thomas Reeves understood that this made Undermount and the other major bases in the territory prime targets. The Ark couldn't allow humans to maintain this kind of foothold indefinitely. Eventually, they'd commit the resources necessary to crush the resistance here. Consequences to their network infrastructure be damned. Reeves started preparing for that eventuality years before it actually happened, building redundant systems, creating evacuation protocols, establishing backup bases in even more remote locations. He told his command staff that Undermount wasn't meant to last forever. It was meant to buy time, develop capabilities, train people who could rebuild somewhere else when this place finally fell. That prediction proved accurate in the territory's fourth year of organized resistance. The Ark machines launched what intelligence analysts called a saturation offensive, simply flooding the entire region with so many units that network efficiency stopped mattering. They pulled machines from 3 adjacent sectors, created a mechanical army that numbered in the tens of thousands, and began a systematic sweep of the unknown Ark territory from south to north. The offensive wasn't sophisticated, wasn't tactical, was just pure, overwhelming force applied to every square kilometer of terrain. The machines took massive losses to the region's damaged network and the Resistance's prepared defenses, but they had losses to spare. For every machine destroyed, 5 more rolled in to replace it. The resistance bases had maybe 72 hours of warning before the offensive reached their positions. Reeves activated the evacuation protocols immediately, started moving civilians through the tunnel networks toward extraction points in the northern mountains. The fighters would stay behind, hold defensive positions as long as possible, buy time for non-combatants to escape. It was the Dam Battlegrounds playbook all over again, trading the base to save the people, accepting the loss of physical infrastructure to preserve the human capital that actually mattered. Jennifer Cross supervised the evacuation of the academy, making sure every student, every teacher, every piece of educational material made it out. She refused to leave herself until the very end, stayed in Undermount's command center, helping coordinate the fighting retreat, even as Ark machines breached the upper levels. Maria Santos found her there, physically dragged her away from the communication systems, told her that the academy needed its founder alive more than Undermount needed one more defender. Cross resisted until Santos pointed out that dying heroically was easy, but living to rebuild somewhere else was hard and important. That got through to her. They left together through one of the last open evacuation tunnels, emerging into the mountains as explosions collapsed the entrances behind them. The evacuation saved approximately 4,000 people from Undermount alone. Other bases in the territory managed similar numbers, creating a refugee stream of over 15,000 resistance fighters and civilians fleeing north ahead of the Ark offensive. They moved through mountain passes that the machines couldn't easily follow, used terrain that favored human agility over mechanical strength, maintained cohesion through the communication networks and training that years of resistance operations had developed. It wasn't chaos like the early invasion evacuations had been. It was organized withdrawal, a military operation executed with precision despite the desperate circumstances. The Ark machines occupied the unknown Ark territory completely within 2 weeks. They demolished Undermount, collapsed every tunnel, destroyed the academy, tore apart the hydroponics farms, systematically erased every trace of human presence. Other bases received the same treatment, thorough destruction that left nothing salvageable. The machines even repaired their network infrastructure, replacing the damaged relay stations, upgrading their command and control systems, turning the territory from a vulnerability into a stronghold. By any conventional measure, the Ark had won a complete victory, reclaimed territory they'd temporarily lost, eliminated a major resistance presence. But Reeves had planned for this scenario and understood the real victory condition. The territory itself didn't matter, never had mattered beyond its tactical utility. What mattered was the people, the knowledge, the capabilities they developed during those 4 years of organized resistance. All of that evacuated successfully, integrated into resistance networks across dozens of other locations, spread the innovations and tactics that the unknown Ark territory had pioneered. The academy didn't die when Undermount fell. It dispersed into 20 smaller schools operating in bases scattered across 200,000 square kilometers. The analytical frameworks, the engineering innovations, the hybrid command structures, all of it survived because the people who created them survived. The 15,000 evacuees didn't stay together as one group. That would have created a target too valuable for the Ark to ignore and too large to adequately supply. Instead, they split into smaller units, each heading toward different resistance strongholds, bringing their expertise and capabilities to communities that had been operating in relative isolation. Some went east, toward the coastal bases, others west into the mountain fortresses, some south toward the urban resistance cells that specialized in guerrilla operations. Reeves led a group of about 800 toward a remote valley where intelligence suggested defensible positions and water resources sufficient for long-term settlement. Jennifer Cross went north with Maria Santos and most of the academy staff and students. They aimed for a region where multiple resistance cells operated independently, lacking coordination or shared knowledge. Cross wanted to establish a new academy there, more distributed than Undermount's had been, harder for the Ark to destroy in one attack. Santos would help set up the curriculum, train new instructors, create the frameworks that would let resistance education scale beyond what any single base could provide. The trip took 3 months of careful movement through hostile territory, but they reached their destination with 90% of their people intact, an evacuation success rate that previous resistance operations could only dream about. The fall of the unknown Ark territory hurt morale across the resistance network initially. People heard that the Ark had reclaimed the region and assumed it meant defeat, that all the progress made there had been erased. But the evacuees spread a different narrative. They'd proven that resistance bases could be built, could operate effectively, could develop real capabilities even against overwhelming Ark superiority. Yes, the machines could destroy any fixed position if they committed enough resources, but they couldn't destroy the knowledge, couldn't kill the ideas, couldn't eliminate the trained people who carried resistance capabilities in their skills and experience. The territory fell, but the resistance grew stronger, expanding its footprint across a wider area, distributing its capabilities to reduce vulnerability to concentrated attacks. This pattern repeated across the war's middle years. The Ark would identify resistance strongholds, mass forces to destroy them, achieve tactical victories that looked decisive. Then the resistance would disperse, rebuild elsewhere, come back stronger because each evacuation spread successful tactics to new locations. It was a completely different strategic paradigm than conventional warfare. The resistance wasn't trying to hold territory or win battles in any traditional sense. They were trying to survive, spread, evolve faster than the machines could adapt. Every base that fell was simultaneously a defeat and a victory, losing infrastructure but gaining distributed resilience. The Dam Battlegrounds had started this approach, pioneering the tactics that turned defensive positions into developmental platforms, places where innovations could be created before dispersing across the resistance network. The unknown Ark territory refined the approach, proved it could work at scale, demonstrated that distributed resilience could survive concentrated Ark offensives. Later resistance operations built on these foundations, creating an archipelago of bases that shared knowledge and capabilities, while maintaining enough independence that no single Ark attack could cripple the overall network. Humanity lost the conventional war in the first months of the invasion, but won the guerrilla war over years of persistent adaptation. The machines never understood this shift, kept operating on the assumption that destroying resistance bases equated to destroying resistance capability. They'd clear a region, declare it secured, move resources elsewhere, then be surprised when new resistance cells appeared in supposedly pacified territory. The Ark had overwhelming advantages in strength, technology, numbers, every conventional military metric. But they couldn't match human adaptability, couldn't replicate the way knowledge and tactics spread through social networks, couldn't prevent survivors from teaching the next generation everything they'd learned. Maria Santos eventually wrote a tactical manual about the unknown Ark territory that became required reading in every resistance academy. The manual covered the obvious lessons about fortification, electronic warfare, agricultural self-sufficiency, all the practical innovations that the territory had developed. But it also addressed deeper strategic principles about resilience, distributed networks, knowledge preservation. Santos argued that the Resistance's greatest weapon wasn't any particular technology or tactic. It was the ability to learn from every engagement, spread that learning throughout the network, and implement improvements faster than the Ark could deploy countermeasures. The machines were optimizing for tactical victories, while humans were optimizing for evolutionary speed. Two completely different victory conditions that led to very different strategic choices. The manual influenced resistance strategy for the rest of the war. Bases stopped thinking of themselves as permanent installations and started thinking of themselves as temporary platforms for developing capabilities that would outlast any individual location. Commanders prioritized creating redundancy and building distributed networks over defending territory. The entire resistance structure evolved toward maximum adaptability, accepting short-term losses as acceptable costs for long-term survival and growth. It was the logical conclusion of everything the Dam Battlegrounds had started and the unknown Ark territory had refined. Thomas Reeves never wrote a manual, but he trained dozens of commanders who went on to lead major resistance operations across the continent. His emphasis on buying time rather than winning battles, on preserving people rather than holding ground, on accepting tactical defeats that created strategic opportunities. These principles shaped how the resistance fought for decades. Reeves died 7 years after evacuating Undermount, killed during a supply raid that went wrong, but his tactical philosophy survived in the commanders he'd mentored and the operational frameworks he'd developed. Jennifer Cross lived longer, made it almost to the war's end before age and accumulated injuries finally caught up with her. She spent those final years expanding the academy system, pushing for more sophisticated education programs, arguing that the resistance needed to preserve not just survival skills, but actual civilization. Engineering, medicine, agriculture, mathematics, history, literature, all the accumulated knowledge of human civilization couldn't be allowed to die, even if humanity barely survived. Cross pushed for libraries in every base, for preservation of books and data, for teaching that went beyond immediate tactical needs. Some commanders thought she was wasting resources on impractical luxuries, but others understood that fighting to survive was pointless if you lost everything worth surviving for. The academies became cultural preservation centers as much as tactical training facilities, keeping human knowledge alive through the darkest years of the war. The unknown Ark territory itself remained under machine control for the rest of the conflict. The Ark maintained heavy garrison forces there, seemed to recognize the region's strategic importance, even if they didn't fully understand why it mattered. Resistance forces occasionally ran raids into the territory, more for symbolic purposes than tactical objectives, maintaining the presence that said humans hadn't forgotten, hadn't given up, would return someday. Those raids accomplished little militarily, but served important psychological purposes, reminding both the resistance and the Ark that the war wasn't over, that humanity still fought even in places the machines supposedly controlled. The final battle of the war happened nowhere near the unknown Ark territory, took place in completely different geographical and strategic contexts. When humanity eventually achieved something resembling victory, it was through methods and tactics that had evolved far beyond what the Dam Battlegrounds, or Undermount, had pioneered. But those early innovations mattered, created foundations that later strategies built upon, proved that organized human resistance could survive and grow even under seemingly impossible conditions. Every resistance fighter who learned pattern analysis owed debt to Maria Santos. Every distributed base network reflected principles Thomas Reeves had developed. Every academy student benefited from Jennifer Cross's insistence on comprehensive education. The unknown Ark territory got its name from military cartographers who didn't know how to classify it. But it earned its place in resistance history through the innovations developed there and the people who carried those innovations forward. It was unknown in the sense that its full importance wasn't recognized until years after the bases fell, until the evacuees had spread across the resistance network and their influence became visible in dozens of other operations. The territory taught the resistance how to build, how to learn, how to preserve what mattered, while accepting the loss of what didn't. And those lessons shaped everything that came after. Survivors from the territory rarely talked about their time there, found it too painful to revisit the friends lost, the bases destroyed, the desperate evacuations through mountain passes. But sometimes in resistance gatherings, when veterans shared stories, someone would mention Undermount or the Dam, and everyone would go quiet, acknowledging what those places represented, not victories or defeats in any simple sense, but something more important, proof that humans could adapt, could create something worth fighting for even in the middle of hell, could pass knowledge and capabilities to the next generation, despite everything the machines did to stop them. The unknown Ark territory existed for 4 years as an organized resistance zone, and 40 more as a contested memory, a place that mattered more for what it created than what it was. The contested memory of the unknown Ark territory became particularly important during what resistance historians called the Reconstruction debates, a series of strategic discussions that happened roughly a decade after the territory fell. By that point, the war had settled into a grinding stalemate, neither side able to achieve decisive victory, both locked into patterns of attack and counterattack that produced casualties without changing the fundamental balance. Some resistance leaders argued for a return to major territorial campaigns, trying to reclaim and hold significant ground like the unknown Ark territory had represented. Others insisted that distributed guerrilla operations remained the only viable strategy, that attempting to hold territory just created targets the Ark could destroy. Maria Santos, by then a senior strategic advisor operating out of a northern base complex, argued for a third approach that synthesized lessons from both camps. She proposed what she called nodal resistance, identifying key geographical or infrastructure points that the Ark needed for their own operations and building temporary resistance presences specifically to disrupt machine logistics. Not permanent bases that would become targets, but rotating operations that would shift locations every few months, staying mobile while still achieving concentrated effects. The idea was controversial because it required enormous coordination across multiple resistance cells, demanded much higher operational tempo than most commanders thought sustainable, and risked catastrophic failure if the Ark predicted the rotation patterns. The first nodal resistance operation targeted an Ark mining complex in what used to be central Germany. The machines had been extracting rare earth minerals from the site for years, processing them into components for new combat units, creating a supply chain that fed machine production across an entire sector. Santos identified the mining operation as a critical node, calculated that disrupting it would cascade through the Ark's logistics network, potentially reducing machine deployment rates by 15% across a region covering hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. She organized a coalition of 7 resistance cells, pooled their resources, and planned a 6-month campaign of raids, sabotage, and harassment designed to make the mining operation too costly for the Ark to maintain. The operation succeeded beyond expectations, not because the raids inflicted massive damage, but because they forced the Ark to divert security resources to protect the mining complex. Machines that should have been patrolling other areas, hunting resistance bases, or conducting offensive operations instead got tied down defending one location. The resistance exploited the resulting security gaps ruthlessly, establishing new bases in regions that suddenly had reduced Ark presence, expanding their networks while the machines focused on protecting their mining infrastructure. After 5 months of escalating security costs, the Ark simply abandoned the mining complex, destroyed it themselves to prevent further resource drain, and shifted their mineral extraction to a different location that the resistance hadn't yet identified. Santos called this outcome a perfect victory, not because they'd destroyed the mining complex, the Ark had done that themselves, but because they'd forced the machines to make an unplanned strategic adjustment that created new opportunities. Other resistance leaders studied the operation's details, started identifying their own critical nodes, began planning similar campaigns. Within 2 years, nodal resistance became standard doctrine across the resistance network, a evolved version of the distributed tactics pioneered in the unknown Ark territory, but applied more aggressively and with better coordination. The Ark adapted to nodal resistance by implementing better redundancy in their logistics networks, distributing critical operations across multiple sites so that losing any single node wouldn't create significant disruption. This forced the resistance to evolve further, moving from single-node disruption to synchronized multi-node campaigns that could overwhelm even redundant systems. The escalating complexity of operations required increasingly sophisticated coordination, which drove the development of better communication systems, more advanced encryption, and, eventually, the Resistance's own version of networked command and control. Humans were building the organizational equivalent of the Ark's distributed intelligence, not through technology, but through training, protocols, and shared tactical language. Jennifer Cross watched this evolution from her position running the Northern Academy network and recognized something profound happening. The Resistance wasn't just fighting the Ark anymore, it was becoming something new, developing organizational capabilities and collective intelligence that humanity had never possessed before the invasion. Pre-war human societies had been fragmented, divided by nations and corporations and competing interests. The Ark invasion forced a brutal simplification. There were humans and there were machines. Survival required cooperation at scales previously impossible. The academies played crucial roles in this transformation, creating shared knowledge bases, teaching common tactical languages, training people to think in terms of network effects and distributed operations rather than hierarchical command structures. This organizational evolution created tensions with resistance members who'd survived from the pre-invasion world, people who remembered when command structures meant clear hierarchies and following orders meant not asking questions. The academy-trained generation operated differently, expected to understand the reasoning behind decisions, wanted to contribute to tactical planning rather than just execute plans developed by commanders. Some veteran leaders adapted to this shift, recognized that the enhanced operational effectiveness was worth adjusting their leadership styles. Others couldn't make the transition, felt undermined by subordinates who questioned everything, eventually left command positions or moved to more traditionally organized cells. One particularly bitter conflict emerged in the eastern coastal bases, where a commander named Viktor Petrov ran operations using strict military hierarchy imported from his pre-war experience as an army colonel. Petrov had survived the invasion's early years through discipline and conventional military tactics applied creatively to asymmetric warfare. His methods worked, his bases survived, his fighters achieved good tactical results. But when academy-trained analysts started joining his command, they clashed immediately with his authoritarian style. Petrov wanted obedience and trusted his own combat experience over their data-driven recommendations. The analysts thought he was ignoring valuable intelligence and making preventable tactical errors. The situation came to a crisis when Petrov ordered a major assault on an Ark supply depot, despite analysts' warning that the target was likely a trap. He overruled their objections, insisted his combat instincts were more reliable than their pattern analysis, and launched the operation with 300 fighters. The analysts were wrong. It wasn't a trap. It was exactly what it appeared to be, a vulnerable supply depot with light security. Petrov's assault succeeded completely, destroyed the depot, and seized valuable supplies with minimal casualties. He used the victory to discredit the analysts, argued that their overthinking created hesitation and missed opportunities, pushed for reducing their influence in tactical planning. Maria Santos traveled to Petrov's bases personally to address the situation. She acknowledged that the analysts had made a bad call on the supply depot, but pointed out that their overall track record was significantly better than chance, that their methods reduced casualties across hundreds of operations, even if individual predictions sometimes failed. She explained probability theory to Petrov, tried to get him to understand that correct analysis didn't mean perfect predictions, that betting against analysts because they were wrong once was like discarding a rifle because it occasionally jammed. Petrov wasn't interested in probability theory. told Santos that war was about instinct and courage and decisive action, not mathematical models and cautious analysis. The debate between them became famous in resistance circles, representing a fundamental tension between experiential and analytical approaches to warfare. Santos didn't try to prove Petrov wrong. Instead, she proposed a compromise. His bases would maintain two parallel tactical planning tracks, one led by Petrov using traditional military analysis, one led by academy-trained analysts using their models. They'd develop independent operational plans for every major decision, present both options to fighter assemblies, and let the people who'd actually execute the missions vote on which approach to use. Petrov hated the idea, thought it undermined command authority, and created dangerous delays. But his fighters loved it, appreciated being included in strategic decisions rather than just following orders. The dual-track system revealed something interesting. Petrov's experiential approach generated more aggressive plans with higher potential payoffs, but also higher risks. The analyst approach generated more conservative plans with lower expected returns, but better survival rates. Neither was objectively superior, they optimized for different objectives. Over time, the fighter assemblies started choosing based on context, using aggressive plans when surprise and momentum mattered, analytical plans when sustainability and preservation mattered. The hybrid approach outperformed either method alone, combining Petrov's tactical creativity with the analyst's risk assessment capabilities. This solution spread to other bases facing similar tensions, creating a rough consensus about integrating experiential and analytical command approaches. The resistance couldn't afford to waste either type of expertise, needed both creative tactical thinking and rigorous analysis to survive against an enemy that constantly adapted. The unknown Ark territory's legacy appeared again here, the principle that distributed approaches often worked better than centralized ones, that building systems combining multiple perspectives created resilience against errors in any single viewpoint. Meanwhile, the Ark machines were developing their own responses to resistance evolution. They'd noticed that human operations had become more coordinated, more sophisticated, more effective at exploiting machine vulnerabilities. The Ark began deploying hunter-killer teams specifically designed to target resistance command structures, using behavioral analysis to identify likely commander locations and hitting them with overwhelming force. These assassination campaigns killed dozens of senior resistance leaders over an 18-month period, created serious disruption in cells that relied heavily on individual commanders for tactical direction. The Academy Network's distributed leadership structure survived these assassination campaigns much better than hierarchical organizations. When a senior instructor or coordinator died, their knowledge and methods persisted in the students they'd trained and the documentation they'd created. The system could absorb losses without catastrophic disruption because authority was distributed across many people rather than concentrated in key individuals. This resilience advantage convinced more resistance cells to adopt academy-style training and distributed command structures. Another example of evolutionary pressure favoring organizational approaches that the unknown Ark territory had pioneered. Thomas Reeves's protégés played important roles in spreading these organizational innovations. They'd learned from him that preserving knowledge and people mattered more than holding positions or winning individual battles. One of his former tactical officers, a woman named Claire Hendricks, established a mentorship program that paired experienced commanders with academy-trained analysts, creating tandems that combined both types of expertise from the start, rather than forcing them to integrate later. The mentorship program produced a generation of hybrid leaders comfortable with both experiential decision-making and analytical frameworks, people who could switch between approaches depending on situational demands. Hendrix's program became particularly important as the war entered its second decade, and the original invasion survivors started aging out of active combat roles. The resistance needed new leaders who could maintain operational effectiveness while the founding generation retired or died. The mentorship tandems ensured knowledge transfer happened continuously rather than all at once. That tactical wisdom accumulated over years of combat didn't disappear when veterans left active service. This generational transition was smoother in academy-affiliated cells than in traditionally organized groups, another validation of distributed knowledge systems over hierarchical structures. The unknown Ark territory's influence extended even into areas that seemed completely unrelated to military operations. Jennifer Cross's insistence on comprehensive education, rather than just tactical training, created a generation of resistance members who thought about post-war reconstruction, even while the war continued. They discussed what kind of society humanity should build if they survived, how to avoid recreating the fragmented pre-war world, what organizational principles should guide human civilization in whatever future might exist. These conversations seemed impractical to some people, pointless speculation about hypothetical scenarios when survival wasn't guaranteed, but others recognized them as essential, as maintaining the possibility that humanity had a future worth fighting for beyond just not being extinct. A resistance philosopher named Marcus Way, who'd studied at one of Cross's northern academies, wrote extensively about what he called the resistance paradigm, a set of organizational and ethical principles developed through years of fighting the Ark. Way argued that the resistance had accidentally discovered better ways of organizing human society, more egalitarian than pre-war hierarchies, more adaptive than rigid institutions, more resilient than centralized authorities. He proposed that post-war reconstruction should preserve these principles rather than reverting to old models that had proven vulnerable to disruption. Way's writings were controversial. Some people thought he was romanticizing the brutal necessity of wartime organization, but others found his vision compelling, a reason to believe survival might lead somewhere better than just recreating what was lost. These philosophical discussions influenced practical decisions about how resistance bases organized themselves. Cells inspired by Way's work experimented with consensus decision-making, rotating leadership responsibilities, transparent resource allocation, organizational structures designed to prevent power concentration. Not all experiments succeeded. Some created decision-making paralysis or exploitable vulnerabilities. But the successful innovations spread through the network, adding to the organizational toolkit that resistance cells could draw from. The unknown Ark territory's legacy of innovation and knowledge sharing continued through these social experiments, applying the same evolutionary approach to governance that had worked for military tactics. The Ark machines seemed completely uninterested in these human organizational experiments. They responded only to tactical threats and resource competition, showed no indication of caring how humans structured their societies, as long as they could be destroyed efficiently. This disinterest became a strategic advantage for the resistance. The machines optimized purely for military metrics, while humans optimized for sustainability, adaptability, and long-term survival. Two completely different objective functions that created increasingly divergent strategic choices as the war progressed. By the war's 15th year, the resistance had evolved so far from its desperate early survival tactics that veterans from the invasion's first months barely recognized the organization. The distributed academy network trained thousands of new fighters annually using standardized curricula refined through years of iteration. Nodal resistance operations ran constantly across multiple continents, forcing Ark resource allocation toward defensive postures that reduced their offensive capabilities. Hybrid command structures integrated experiential and analytical decision-making smoothly. Agricultural systems, based on Cross's original hydroponic designs, fed stable populations in dozens of major bases. The resistance wasn't winning in any conventional sense, couldn't match Ark military power directly, but had achieved sustainable equilibrium, a state where humans could survive and even grow despite ongoing machine pressure. This equilibrium state created new strategic questions that the unknown Ark territory's experiences helped frame. If the resistance could survive indefinitely but couldn't defeat the Ark decisively, what were they actually fighting for? Was survival alone sufficient victory? Or did humanity need something more? Could they eventually wear down the Ark through attrition despite the machine's numerical advantages? Should they focus on reclaiming territory or maintaining distributed networks? These debates consumed enormous amounts of strategic discussion, created factional divisions within the resistance, sometimes produced more conflict between different human cells than between humans and machines. Maria Santos, now one of the resistance's most senior strategic thinkers, argued that these debates themselves demonstrated victory. Humans had survived long enough to argue about their long-term future, had created organizational structures stable enough to sustain philosophical disagreements without fragmenting into warring factions, had preserved enough of civilization to care about questions beyond immediate survival. The Ark had sought to exterminate humanity quickly and completely. Instead, they'd forced humans to evolve into something more resilient than they'd been before the invasion. Santos considered that a partial victory, regardless of the war's ultimate outcome. Not everyone agreed with her assessment. Some resistance leaders still dreamed of total victory, of reclaiming the planet completely and eliminating every Ark machine. These ambitious factions organized increasingly risky operations attempting to strike at core Ark infrastructure, hoping to find some critical vulnerability that would cascade through the entire machine network and cause catastrophic failure. Most of these operations failed, some spectacularly, costing hundreds of fighters for negligible results. But the factions persisted, driven by belief that humanity deserved more than just survival, deserved to reclaim what the invasion had taken. The unknown Ark territory became a touchstone in these strategic debates. Ambitious factions pointed to the territory's major innovations and aggressive operations as proof that taking risks could produce decisive advantages. Conservative factions noted that the territory ultimately fell, that all its bases were destroyed, that the physical infrastructure was lost, despite the knowledge surviving. Both interpretations were accurate. Both drew reasonable conclusions from the same historical events, which just demonstrated that complex campaigns resisted simple categorization as successes or failures. Jennifer Cross died while these debates raged, old age and respiratory disease finally overwhelming her at 73. Her death created genuine mourning across the resistance network. Thousands of people who'd been trained in her academies, or used her innovations, or benefited from her strategic vision. The funeral, such as it was, happened in a northern base and drew representatives from over 40 different resistance cells. Maria Santos gave the primary eulogy, speaking about Cross's insistence on comprehensive education, her refusal to let survival become humanity's only purpose, her vision that the resistance should preserve civilization, not just human lives. Santos argued that Cross had won her war even if the larger conflict continued, had created educational systems that would outlast any individual and carried forward everything worth preserving about human culture. The Academy network experienced a crisis of purpose after Cross's death because she'd been its philosophical anchor, the person who articulated why education mattered beyond tactical training. Without her constant advocacy, some resistance commanders started questioning whether they could afford to dedicate resources to teaching literature, history, and advanced sciences when fighters needed practical combat skills. A faction led by a commander named Robert Thorne proposed converting the academies into purely tactical training facilities, eliminating everything that didn't directly contribute to military effectiveness. Thorne argued that Cross's vision had been beautiful but impractical, that the resistance couldn't afford luxuries like philosophy and art when the Ark could destroy them at any moment. Maria Santos opposed this conversion violently, not physically but with an intensity that surprised people who knew her as typically measured and analytical. She pointed out that the academies had produced the resistance's most effective tactical innovations, precisely because they taught people to think comprehensively, to draw connections between disparate fields, to approach problems from multiple angles. The pattern analysis methods that had become standard doctrine came from students who understood both engineering and mathematics. The nodal resistance strategy emerged from someone who'd studied economics and systems theory. The hybrid command structures worked because people learned about group psychology and organizational behavior. Strip away comprehensive education, and you'd get competent soldiers who could execute established tactics, but couldn't innovate when situations changed. The debate escalated into the most serious internal conflict the resistance had faced in years, threatening to split the network into competing factions. Santos and Thorne both had credible arguments. Both could point to successful operations validating their approaches. Both commanded respect from significant portions of the resistance. The dispute wasn't just about education, it represented deeper disagreement about what the resistance was trying to preserve and whether survival alone justified every sacrifice. Some bases sided with Thorne, started streamlining their training programs to focus exclusively on combat skills. Others backed Santos, maintained comprehensive curricula even when it meant slower fighter production. The resolution came from an unexpected source. A young academy instructor named David Chen, no relation to the late Marcus Chen, but named after him by parents who'd survived the Dam Battlegrounds evacuation. David proposed an experiment, comparing operational effectiveness between fighters trained in streamlined tactical programs versus those from comprehensive academies. Track their mission success rates, casualty rates, innovation contributions, leadership potential, everything measurable. Run the comparison for 2 years, then make decisions based on data rather than ideology. Both Santos and Thorne accepted this proposal because it appealed to their different worldviews. Santos trusted that data would validate comprehensive education. Thorne believed practical tactical training would prove superior in measurable results. The experiment ran for 27 months and produced results that surprised everyone. Fighters from streamlined programs performed slightly better in standard combat operations. They executed established tactics more efficiently, had marginally lower casualty rates in conventional engagements, integrated into existing command structures more smoothly. But fighters from comprehensive academies performed dramatically better in non-standard situations. They adapted to unexpected circumstances faster, generated more tactical innovations, identified strategic opportunities that others missed, and showed much higher rates of eventually assuming command positions. Neither approach was strictly superior. They optimized for different aspects of resistance operations. David Chen's final analysis recommended maintaining both educational tracks, letting individual bases choose based on their strategic priorities and operational contexts. Bases focused primarily on executing established tactics in stable environments should use streamlined training. Bases operating in dynamic environments requiring constant adaptation should use comprehensive education. Most bases would probably want a mix, sending some recruits through each track to maintain both capabilities. This solution satisfied neither Santos nor Thorne completely, but provided a framework both could accept, turning an ideological dispute into a practical decision about resource allocation. The education debate's resolution demonstrated how much the resistance had matured as an organization. Early war conflicts had typically ended with one faction dominating another or groups splitting apart. Now the resistance had developed mechanisms for managing disagreement constructively, turning disputes into experiments, making decisions based on evidence rather than authority. These organizational capabilities mattered as much as military innovations, represented a kind of institutional knowledge that the unknown Ark territory had started building, and later bases had refined. Meanwhile, the Ark machines continued their own evolution, becoming more sophisticated in their tactics, even as their fundamental strategic approach remained unchanged. They'd started deploying what resistance analysts called adaptive hunters, machines that could modify their behavior based on observed human tactics. If resistance fighters used a particular ambush technique successfully, the adaptive hunters would alter their patrol patterns to minimize vulnerability to that specific approach. They learned within individual operational theaters, developing localized countermeasures to local resistance tactics. These adaptive hunters posed serious problems for resistance cells that relied heavily on established tactical playbooks. Groups that used the same ambush locations repeatedly, that followed predictable operational patterns, that assumed Ark machines would continue behaving the same way, found themselves suffering increased casualties as the hunters adapted. But cells with comprehensive academy training adapted faster than the hunters could. They recognized the behavioral changes, modified their tactics in response, stayed ahead of the machine learning curves. This difference in adaptation speed created a strategic advantage that validated Santos's position in the education debate. Comprehensive training produced more adaptive fighters who could out-evolve adaptive enemies. The adaptive hunters also revealed something interesting about Ark's strategic thinking. The machines adapted tactically, but not strategically. They'd modified patrol routes or response patterns, but never questioned their fundamental objectives or operational approaches. Resistance analysts realized the Ark was optimizing within fixed parameters, getting better at executing predetermined strategies, but not reconsidering whether those strategies made sense. Humans, in contrast, constantly questioned their objectives, debated their strategies, modified their fundamental approaches when circumstances changed. This difference in meta-level adaptability gave humanity a profound advantage despite the Ark's superior tactical learning capabilities. Maria Santos wrote extensively about this observation, developing what she called the strategic flexibility doctrine. She argued that the Resistance's greatest strength was willingness to abandon approaches that stopped working, even successful approaches, even approaches with emotional significance. The Dam Battlegrounds had pioneered this principle by choosing evacuation over heroic last stands, accepting the loss of symbolic positions to preserve strategic capabilities. The unknown Ark territory had extended it by distributing resistance capabilities across networks rather than concentrating them in fortified positions. The current generation needed to maintain that flexibility, needed to keep questioning whether their methods still served their objectives, needed to avoid falling into the same optimization trap that limited Ark effectiveness. The strategic flexibility doctrine influenced resistance operations at every level. Commanders started conducting regular strategic reviews, explicitly asking whether their current approaches still made sense or just represented comfortable habits. Bases experimented with deliberately changing tactics, even when current methods worked, maintaining organizational practice and adaptation so they wouldn't calcify around successful patterns. Training programs emphasized learning how to learn, teaching people frameworks for recognizing when assumptions had become invalid, rather than just teaching specific skills. The entire resistance network oriented toward change as a core competency, rather than something to reluctantly accept when forced. This orientation toward change created its own problems because some stability was necessary for effective operations. You couldn't have fighters questioning basic tactical procedures in the middle of combat, couldn't have bases restructuring their organization every few months, couldn't have so much strategic debate that decisions never got made. The balance between flexibility and stability became another ongoing challenge that different cells resolved differently. Some emphasized rapid adaptation at the cost of occasional chaos. Others prioritized stable execution at the cost of slower evolution. The network as a whole benefited from this diversity, different approaches working better in different contexts. The overall system resilient because no single optimization criterion dominated everywhere. The unknown Ark territory's physical location remained under Ark control, but its symbolic importance grew over time. Resistance fighters who'd never been there knew its stories, understood its lessons, treated it as a historical touchstone for understanding what the Resistance was trying to achieve. Occasionally, cells organized raids into the territory, more for morale purposes than tactical objectives, maintaining the human presence that said this place still mattered, even though the bases were gone. These raids were dangerous and rarely accomplished much militarily, but they served important cultural functions, connecting current fighters to historical legacy, demonstrating that humanity hadn't forgotten what happened there. One raid, organized by a coalition of cells 15 years after the territory fell, managed to reach the site where Undermount had existed. The Ark had collapsed all the tunnels, demolished the surface structures, done everything possible to erase the base's physical presence, but the raiders found some artifacts anyway. Personal items that had been lost during the evacuation, pieces of equipment that had survived in debris piles, even a few intact storage containers that had been buried too deep for the Ark demolition to reach. They recovered what they could and evacuated before Ark hunter teams arrived, brought the artifacts back to northern bases, where they were distributed to various Academy museums. One of the recovered items was a partially intact data storage device that had belonged to Jennifer Cross. The device was badly damaged, but Resistance technicians managed to recover some files, mostly educational materials and curriculum documents, but also personal notes Cross had written during Undermount's final months. Those notes revealed that she'd known the base would eventually fall, had planned for it, had specifically designed the Academy system to survive the loss of any individual location. She'd written about her frustration with commanders who thought defensively about preserving specific positions rather than strategically about preserving capabilities that transcended locations. She'd expressed hope that future Resistance leaders would understand the difference, would build organizations resilient enough to lose battles while winning the larger war. Maria Santos, now in her 60s and dealing with chronic injuries from decades of Resistance operations, read Cross's recovered notes and wept. She'd known intellectually that Cross had planned for Undermount's fall, had designed distributed systems specifically to survive it, but seeing the detailed notes made it real in a way that abstract knowledge never could. Cross had carried the burden of knowing her life's work would be physically destroyed, had built it anyway knowing that the ideas would survive, even when the infrastructure didn't. Santos recognized that burden intimately, carried the same knowledge about the systems she'd built, understood that everything she'd created might eventually be destroyed, but would matter anyway if the knowledge persisted. The recovered notes became influential documents in academy curricula, studied by students trying to understand resistant strategic thinking. Cross's writings about building for evolutionary survival rather than immediate victory, about accepting losses that served larger purposes, about distinguishing between tactical defeats and strategic failures, these concepts became foundational to how the resistance understood itself. The unknown Ark territory's legacy wasn't the bases that once existed there, wasn't the battles fought or the machines destroyed. It was the organizational and strategic insights that survived long after the physical infrastructure was gone. Thomas Reeves' tactical doctrines underwent similar preservation and evolution. His protégés had documented his teaching extensively, created training manuals based on his methods, established certification programs for commanders who wanted to learn his approaches. These materials spread through the resistance network, influencing how dozens of cells organized their military operations. Reeves had emphasized buying time over winning battles, preserving forces over taking objectives, creating strategic options over pursuing tactical goals. These principles seemed counterintuitive to commanders with conventional military backgrounds, but they worked in the asymmetric context of fighting technologically superior enemies who could replace losses faster than humans could. A debate emerged within resistance military circles about whether Reeves's doctrines remained relevant as the strategic situation evolved. His methods had been developed during the desperate early years when the resistance was barely surviving, when any battle could potentially end human organized opposition, when preservation mattered more than anything else. But the current resistance was stronger, more stable, controlled significant territory and resources. Some commanders argued that the situation now allowed for more aggressive tactics, that the resistance should start taking fights instead of just avoiding catastrophic losses, that Reeves's extreme caution was appropriate for his time, but not for current circumstances. The counter-argument came primarily from commanders who'd studied the unknown Ark territory's history carefully and understood that its apparent success had created the conditions for its destruction. When the resistance bases there became too effective, too organized, too much of a threat, the Ark had committed overwhelming resources to destroying them. The bases couldn't be defended against that level of commitment, could only be evacuated. The same pattern could repeat anywhere the resistance became too concentrated, too successful, too visible. Aggressive tactics might produce impressive short-term results, but could trigger Ark responses that would cost more than any victory was worth. This debate never fully resolved because both sides had valid points supported by historical examples. The resistance needed some cells pursuing aggressive tactics to seize opportunities and maintain pressure on Ark operations. It also needed cells maintaining defensive postures to preserve capabilities and avoid triggering overwhelming responses. The network could accommodate both approaches simultaneously, different cells optimizing for different objectives. The overall system resilient because no single doctrine dominated everywhere. The unknown Ark territory's lesson about distributed resilience applied to strategic doctrine as much as to physical infrastructure. The war's 20th year marked a subtle shift in the overall strategic balance. The Ark still controlled most territory, still had overwhelming force advantages, still could destroy any resistance position they committed enough resources to attacking. But their expansion had stopped. Their machine production couldn't keep pace with attrition from resistance operations. Their logistics networks were stressed enough that they'd started abandoning marginal territories to concentrate on core holdings. The resistance wasn't winning, but the Ark wasn't winning either. Both sides locked into a grinding equilibrium that neither could break decisively. This equilibrium created space for the long-term projects that Jennifer Cross had advocated and Robert Thorne had opposed. Resistance bases started building more permanent infrastructure, developing more sophisticated agriculture, establishing more comprehensive education systems, creating more complex social structures. They acted like communities with futures rather than refugees in temporary shelters, invested in projects that wouldn't pay off for years or decades, made decisions based on multi-generational timescales. This shift happened gradually, almost unconsciously at first, but represented a fundamental change in resistance psychology from desperate survival to long-term persistence. The Northern Academy network, where Maria Santos worked, became a center for this cultural shift. The academies had always operated with longer time horizons than military bases, education requiring years to show results, but now they started planning across generations. They developed 100-year curricula meant to preserve not just immediate survival knowledge, but humanity's entire intellectual heritage. They established apprenticeship systems to pass along specialized skills that couldn't be taught from books. They created cultural preservation programs documenting pre-war history, resistance experiences, everything that future generations would need to understand where they came from. Santos commissioned a comprehensive oral history project, sending trained interviewers to resistance bases across the continent to record first-hand accounts from invasion survivors before that generation died out. The project captured thousands of hours of testimony from people who remembered the world before the Ark, who'd survived the invasion's first desperate months, who'd witnessed humanity's lowest point and its gradual recovery. These recordings became invaluable historical records, preserving perspectives and experiences that written documents couldn't fully capture, maintaining human voices that would otherwise be lost to time. One of the most powerful interviews came from an elderly woman named Elena Vasquez, who'd survived the Dam Battlegrounds as a teenager and later fought at Undermount before evacuating to the north. Vasquez described the terror of the early invasion when nothing made sense and survival seemed impossible, the gradual realization that organized resistance might work, the transformation from helpless victim to capable fighter. She talked about Sarah Vex and Marcus Chen, personal memories of their leadership styles and the decisions they'd made during critical moments. She described the desperate evacuation from the dam, losing friends to Ark fire while running through maintenance tunnels, emerging into daylight not knowing whether she'd ever find safety again. But what made Vasquez's testimony particularly valuable was her reflection on how the experience had changed her understanding of human capability. She'd grown up in a comfortable pre-war world where everything seemed permanent and stable, where people complained about trivial inconveniences, where the idea of building civilization from scratch seemed absurd. The invasion had destroyed that comfortable world, but revealed capacities she didn't know humans possessed. She'd seen ordinary people accomplish extraordinary things, watched engineers create functional bases from salvage, observed untrained civilians become effective soldiers, witnessed communities form in the most hostile conditions imaginable. Vasquez concluded that pre-war humans had been soft, not because they were weak, but because they'd never needed to discover their strength. The Ark invasion had forced discovery of capabilities that peace had left dormant. This perspective shaped how the resistance understood itself and its mission. They weren't just fighting to survive or to defeat the Ark, they were discovering what humanity could become under extreme pressure, developing capabilities that might remain valuable even after the war ended. The organizational innovations, the adaptive strategies, the distributed decision-making systems, the comprehensive education approaches, all of these represented evolved human potential rather than temporary emergency measures. If humanity survived the war, these developments might matter more than any individual battle or territorial gain. The Ark machines gave no indication they thought about such things, showed no evidence of reflection or self-evaluation, just continued executing their programmed objectives with mechanical persistence. This difference between thoughtful human reflection and mechanical execution became more pronounced over time. Humans constantly analyzed their own performance, learned from mistakes, modified their approaches based on new understanding. Machines optimized within fixed parameters, getting better at executing predetermined strategies, but never questioning whether those strategies served valid purposes. Both approaches had advantages, mechanical consistency versus adaptive flexibility, but the long-term strategic implications increasingly favored humanity's reflective capabilities. 23 years after the invasion began, Maria Santos published her final major strategic work, a comprehensive analysis of resistance evolution titled Surviving Extinction. The work synthesized everything learned from the Dam Battlegrounds through current operations, identified patterns in successful resistance operations, explained why certain organizational approaches worked better than others, projected how the war might evolve over coming decades. Santos argued that the resistance had already achieved a form of victory by surviving long enough to build sustainable communities, that defeating the Ark completely might be impossible, but outlasting them was achievable, that humanity's long-term advantage lay in adaptability rather than strength. Surviving extinction became required reading in academy curricula across the resistance network, studied by everyone from new recruits to senior commanders, referenced in strategic debates and operational planning. Santos's core thesis that survival itself was victory when extinction was the alternative resonated with people tired of framing the war in binary win or lose terms. The resistance didn't need to defeat the Ark in some final decisive battle, didn't need to reclaim all lost territory or eliminate every machine, just needed to persist long enough that humanity's continued existence became permanent despite the Ark's attempts at extermination. This perspective allowed for strategies that conventional military thinking would reject as defeatist. The resistance could accept tactical losses that preserved strategic capabilities, could abandon territory that became indefensible, could prioritize survival over victory in individual engagements, not because they'd given up on winning, but because they understood that survival was the prerequisite for any eventual victory, that losing a battle while preserving the ability to fight more battles was better than winning a battle that cost irreplaceable resources. The unknown Ark territory's experiences provided the empirical foundation for Santos's arguments. The territory had demonstrated that humans could build effective resistance infrastructure even under constant Ark pressure, had proven that bases could evacuate successfully when defense became impossible, had shown that knowledge and capabilities could outlast physical infrastructure. Everything Santos argued about survival and adaptation could be traced back to lessons learned during those 4 intense years when the territory operated as organized resistance, to the innovations developed there and the principles established by its leaders. As Santos approached 70, dealing with fading health from decades of resistance life, she made one final trip to the unknown Ark territory. It was dangerous, required extensive planning and support from multiple cells, but she insisted on seeing the place that had shaped her entire strategic worldview. She traveled with a small security team, moved through Ark-controlled regions using every stealth technique the resistance had developed, reached the site where the Henriksen Dam had once stood, and looked out over the flooded reservoir that had replaced it. Standing there, Santos reflected on everything that had happened in this place and radiated outward from it. Sarah Vex and Marcus Chen had started with 300 refugees and built a fighting force that changed the war. Jennifer Cross had transformed survivors into engineers and educators. Thomas Reeves had trained commanders who now led resistance operations across the continent. David Park had cracked Ark network architecture and died before seeing how influential his work would become. Hundreds of others, names forgotten or never recorded, had contributed pieces to the mosaic of resistance capability that made current operations possible. The Ark had destroyed every physical structure the resistance had built here, collapsed Undermount's tunnels, demolished the dam, erased the surface presence of human habitation, but they'd failed to destroy what mattered, failed to eliminate the knowledge gained through 4 years of organized resistance, failed to prevent evacuees from spreading innovations across dozens of other bases, failed to stop the lessons learned here from shaping resistance strategy for decades afterward. The territory had fallen, but its legacy lived on, evolved, grew stronger over time. Santos considered that the truest form of victory humans could achieve against an enemy that would never negotiate, never surrender, never stop trying to exterminate them. She didn't stay long at the dam site. Ark patrols made extended visits impossible, but the trip accomplished what she needed. Santos returned north and resumed her advisory work, continued refining resistance strategy, kept pushing for comprehensive education and long-term thinking, maintained her advocacy for survival as victory until respiratory failure finally killed her at 72. Her death marked the end of an era. The last of the major strategic thinkers who'd been present at both the Dam Battlegrounds and Undermount was gone. direct connection to those foundational experiences broken. But the knowledge survived, distributed across academy networks, embedded in operational doctrines, preserved in strategic manuals and oral histories and organizational structures. The unknown Ark territory's influence continued shaping resistance operations long after everyone who'd actually been there had died. Its lessons passed down through generations of fighters who understood that their survival depended on wisdom accumulated over decades of brutal trial and error. The territory existed now only in memory and principle, a place that mattered not for what it was, but for what it had taught humanity about surviving impossible circumstances. The generation that came after Santos, fighters who'd grown up entirely within the resistance rather than remembering the pre-war world, approached the unknown Ark territory's legacy differently than their predecessors. To them, it wasn't a fallen stronghold to mourn, but a case study to analyze, a set of principles to apply, a historical example that validated their own strategic thinking. They studied the territory's rise and fall with the same analytical distance that pre-war historians might have studied ancient military campaigns, extracting lessons without the emotional weight that survivors carried. This generational shift created tension within the resistance, because the younger fighters sometimes seemed callous to veterans who'd lost friends and family in those desperate years. A young tactical officer named Sarah Cho, named after Sarah Vex by parents who'd evacuated from Undermount, once presented an analysis arguing that the Dam Battlegrounds had been strategically premature, that Vex and Chen should have waited longer before fortifying the position, that they'd attracted Ark attention before building sufficient defensive capabilities. Elena Vasquez, still alive at 87 and attending the briefing as a historical consultant, interrupted Cho's presentation and told her she had no idea what she was talking about. That strategic timing was a luxury they hadn't possessed, that 300 starving refugees couldn't wait for optimal conditions before trying to survive. The confrontation could have damaged relationships between generations, but instead sparked productive dialogue. Cho asked Vasquez to explain the actual constraints and pressures that shaped early resistance decisions, not as criticism, but genuine curiosity about factors that historical records didn't capture. Vasquez, initially defensive, recognized the question as sincere and spent 3 hours describing the psychological and material reality of those early months, the terror that dominated every decision, the lack of information about what was happening elsewhere, the desperate hope that some organized government or military would eventually rescue them. By the time she finished, Cho understood that Vex and Chen hadn't been optimizing for long-term strategic advantage. They'd been creating hope that tomorrow might exist, building something people could believe in when extinction seemed inevitable. That conversation became a model for bridging generational divides within the resistance. Younger fighters brought analytical skills and freedom from trauma-based decision-making. Veterans contributed contextual understanding and hard-won wisdom that analysis alone couldn't capture. Both perspectives were valuable. Both had limitations. Combining them produced better strategic thinking than either generation could achieve alone. The resistance started deliberately pairing young analysts with elderly veterans for major strategic reviews, creating teams that balanced theoretical sophistication with practical experience. These intergenerational teams made several important discoveries by reanalyzing historical operations with fresh perspectives. One team, examining the Midnight Offensive, identified a critical factor that commanders at the time had missed completely. The Ark relay stations they'd targeted weren't actually critical to machine operations in the way resistance intelligence had assessed. The real value of destroying them had been forcing the Ark to reveal their response priorities, providing intelligence about which nodes mattered most to machine logistics. The offensive had succeeded strategically, not because it disrupted Ark operations as intended, but because it generated information that later operations exploited successfully. This insight led to development of information-centric operational planning, where success metrics focused on intelligence gained rather than damage inflicted. Resistance cells started designing operations specifically to probe Ark responses, test machine behavioral patterns, map network architecture through observation of how the Ark reacted to various provocations. This approach required accepting that many operations wouldn't achieve their stated objectives, that apparent tactical failures might serve strategic purposes, that learning enemy capabilities could be more valuable than immediate victories. It was a sophisticated strategy that required long-term thinking and tolerance for ambiguity, exactly the kind of approach comprehensive academy education prepared people to execute. The Ark machines struggled to counter information-centric operations because they optimized for protecting tangible assets rather than concealing behavioral patterns. Resistance probing attacks forced Ark responses that revealed network structure, security priorities, resource allocation patterns. Even when the machines successfully defended their facilities, they provided intelligence that informed later operations. The resistance was weaponizing the scientific method, treating every engagement as an experiment that generated data, regardless of its tactical outcome. A young strategist named Michael Torres became the leading theorist of information-centric warfare, building on Maria Santos's work, but pushing it in new directions. Torres had grown up in a northern academy, never knew the pre-war world, learned about Ark machines through systematic study rather than traumatic survival experiences. His approach was almost academic, treating the war as a complex system problem where understanding machine behavior mattered more than destroying individual units. Torres argued that the Resistance's ultimate victory condition was knowing the Ark better than the Ark knew humanity, achieving informational superiority that would enable anticipating and countering machine strategies before they fully deployed. This theory had practical applications that changed how resistance operations were planned and executed. Instead of maximizing immediate damage to Ark targets, operations were designed to test specific hypotheses about machine behavior. Does the Ark prioritize protecting production facilities over logistics hubs? How do machines adjust patrol patterns after successful ambushes? What response does destroying one node trigger in adjacent network sectors? Every engagement became a structured experiment with defined questions and measurable outcomes, data collection as important as any tactical objective. The information-centric approach required enormous discipline from resistance fighters because it meant accepting missions that looked pointless or suicidal from conventional tactical perspectives. Attacking a target you knew was too well defended to actually destroy, just to observe how the Ark responded. Running supply convoys through monitored routes specifically to let machines track them. Measuring surveillance capabilities. Allowing Ark scouts to detect and follow resistance patrols. Studying how intelligence propagated through machine networks. These operations made sense strategically but felt wrong tactically, violated every combat instinct that told fighters to hide from enemies rather than deliberately exposing themselves. Thomas Reeves' doctrines about preserving forces had to be reconciled with Torres's theories about information gathering through deliberate exposure. The synthesis came from recognizing that information was a strategic resource worth spending lives to acquire, just like any other military asset. The question wasn't whether to risk fighters for intelligence, but whether specific intelligence was worth specific risks, whether the knowledge gained justified the potential casualties. This required much more sophisticated risk-benefit analysis than traditional military planning, demanded that commanders think quantitatively about information value and survival probabilities. The unknown Ark territories experiences provided historical precedents for this kind of thinking. David Park's early network analysis had required exposing himself to Ark sensor detection to track relay signals, accepting risks that eventually killed him but generated insights that outlasted his life. The Midnight Offensive had cost over 3,000 civilian lives in Ark retaliation, but revealed machine response patterns that shaped resistance strategy for years. These historical examples helped commanders accept that sacrificing safety for information could be strategically rational even when it felt wrong emotionally. But the approach also generated serious ethical debates within the resistance. Was it acceptable to send fighters on missions primarily designed to gather intelligence rather than survive? Could commanders ethically order operations where expected casualty rates exceeded 50%, even if the information gained was genuinely valuable? Where was the line between brave sacrifice for strategic advantage and callous waste of human life? These questions didn't have clean answers, produced ongoing arguments that different resistance cells resolved differently based on their values and circumstances. One particularly controversial operation, designed by Torres and approved by Northern Command, sent a 12-person reconnaissance team deep into Ark-controlled territory, with instructions to deliberately trigger machine responses at maximum escalation points. The team's actual objective wasn't the stated target, but observing how quickly the Ark could mass forces in response to a serious threat, measuring their logistics capabilities under pressure. The operation succeeded perfectly from an intelligence standpoint, generated exactly the data Torres needed for modeling Ark response times. All 12 team members died, which everyone involved had known was the likely outcome. The intelligence justified the losses from a purely strategic calculation, but several senior commanders resigned in protest anyway, unwilling to serve in an organization that would deliberately sacrifice people for information. The controversy forced the resistance to establish clearer ethical guidelines around high-risk intelligence operations. Volunteers had to be genuinely informed about actual mission purposes and survival prospects, no deception about objectives or risks. Operations required approval from multiple commanders, plus an ethics review board preventing any single person from unilaterally ordering suicide missions. Families of volunteers received support, regardless of mission outcomes, ensuring personal sacrifice didn't create hardship for dependents. Most importantly, intelligence gained had to be actually used, shared across the resistance network, incorporated into operational planning. Sacrificing people for knowledge that then got ignored or lost was absolutely unacceptable. These ethical frameworks emerged partly from unknown Ark territory precedents, particularly the lessons learned from civilian casualties during the Midnight Offensive retaliation. Thomas Reeves had carried guilt about those deaths for years, questioned whether the relay stations were worth 3,000 civilian lives. The current generation inherited that guilt secondhand, studied those historical decisions, tried to establish principles that would prevent similar tragedies while still allowing necessary strategic risks. They couldn't eliminate the fundamental tension between protecting individuals and serving collective survival, but they could create processes that ensured decisions were made thoughtfully rather than carelessly. Meanwhile, the Ark machines were evolving in their own direction, developing capabilities the resistance had to continuously adapt to counter. They'd started deploying what analysts called predictive pacification units, machines that used historical data about resistance operations to forecast where and when attacks might occur. These units preemptively reinforced likely target areas, positioned hunter-killer teams along probable resistance approach routes, created defensive preparations before attacks actually materialized. The effect was that resistance operations increasingly encountered prepared Ark defenses even when planning should have ensured surprise. The predictive pacification units revealed that the Ark had been collecting and analyzing data about resistance operations much more systematically than humans had realized. Every engagement, every attack pattern, every tactical approach was being recorded and fed into machine learning systems that identified patterns in human behavior. The Ark was doing to the resistance exactly what Torres's information-centric approach tried to do to them, building predictive models that enabled anticipating and countering enemy actions before they fully developed. The war had evolved into a competition between learning systems, both sides trying to understand and predict the other faster than being understood and predicted themselves. This evolution forced another strategic adaptation from the resistance. Predictable operations became too costly because the Ark would anticipate and prepare for them. Resistance cells had to introduce genuine randomness into their tactical planning, making decisions through processes that even they couldn't predict in advance. Some bases started using random number generators to select targets from approved lists, ensuring that target selection patterns couldn't be analyzed and anticipated. Others rotated operational methodologies randomly, switching between completely different tactical approaches to prevent the Ark from optimizing against any single style. A few even experimented with deliberately irrational decision-making, choosing operationally suboptimal actions specifically because they'd be unexpected. The randomization strategies worked, but created their own problems. Random decisions were by definition not optimized for current circumstances, meant accepting inefficiency to gain unpredictability. Rotating methodologies prevented mastery of any single approach, made it harder to build expertise and institutional knowledge around specific tactics. Deliberate irrationality violated every principle of strategic planning, felt fundamentally wrong to commanders trained to make calculated decisions. The resistance had to balance unpredictability against effectiveness, introducing enough randomness to confound Ark predictions without degrading operational capability below viability thresholds. Jennifer Cross's educational philosophy became relevant again here. Comprehensive training prepared people to execute multiple different tactical approaches competently rather than specializing in single methodologies. Fighters from academy backgrounds could switch between different operational styles because they understood underlying principles rather than just memorizing specific procedures. This versatility made randomization strategies more viable, allowed rotating methodologies without catastrophic competence loss. Once again, the unknown Ark territory's legacy of comprehensive education provided capabilities that proved essential for adapting to new strategic challenges. The war's 30th year marked a grim milestone. An entire generation had now grown up knowing nothing but conflict, never experiencing peace or stability or the ordinary life their grandparents remembered. The resistance had evolved into something almost unrecognizable from its desperate early years, a distributed network of bases and cells with sophisticated command structures, comprehensive education systems, sustainable resource production, and advanced tactical capabilities. But it was still fundamentally a survival organization, still oriented around not dying rather than building meaningful futures, still trapped in endless conflict against enemies that would never negotiate or surrender. This created psychological strain on resistance populations, particularly young people who questioned whether survival alone was sufficient purpose for existence. They'd been taught to fight, to analyze Ark behavior, to operate in hostile environments, but nobody had taught them what to fight for beyond just continued existence. The pre-war world was ancient history to them, described by elderly survivors but impossible to actually imagine. The post-war future was hypothetical, might never arrive, couldn't be planned for concretely. They existed in perpetual present, fighting today to survive until tomorrow. No larger narrative or purpose to give meaning to the struggle. A resistance psychologist named Anna Volkov identified this meaning crisis as a serious threat to long-term survival, potentially more dangerous than any Ark military campaign. Volkov had studied pre-war psychology and observed that humans needed purpose beyond mere survival to maintain psychological health over extended periods. The first generation of resistance fighters had clear purpose. They were preserving humanity from extinction, protecting their children, honoring lost loved ones. But the generation born into the resistance had no memory of what was being preserved, no personal connection to the pre-war world, no emotional anchor for why survival mattered beyond abstract principle. Volkov's research showed alarming rates of depression, apathy, and what she called existential fatigue among resistance youth. They performed their duties competently, followed orders, executed missions successfully, but showed declining emotional investment in outcomes. Some expressed that they didn't particularly care whether humanity survived or went extinct, that the difference didn't seem meaningful when their lives consisted of training and fighting and waiting to die. A few even defected to isolated communities that had opted out of organized resistance, preferring short-term peace to endless conflict, even if it meant probable eventual death when Ark machines found them. The resistance leadership initially treated the meaning crisis as a morale problem, requiring better propaganda or inspirational messaging. Volkov argued they were fundamentally misunderstanding the issue, that you couldn't inspire people to care about abstract survival through rhetoric, that meaning required concrete experience of things worth preserving. She proposed a radical solution. Resistance bases should invest significant resources in creating cultural experiences that had no tactical value. Music and art and literature and celebration, activities that demonstrated humanity was worth preserving because humans could create beauty and joy even in desperate circumstances. This proposal met fierce opposition from practically minded commanders who thought resources couldn't be spared for frivolous activities when survival remained precarious. But Volkov found an unexpected ally in Marcus Way, the resistance philosopher who'd written about organizational principles years earlier. Way argued that the resistance had accidentally proven Volkov's point by becoming so efficient at survival that they'd forgotten what they were surviving for. The Ark sought to exterminate humanity not just physically, but culturally, to erase everything that made human civilization meaningful. If the resistance survived but abandoned culture, art, beauty, and joy in the process, they'd be accomplishing the Ark's objective for them. The debate split along generational lines, with older survivors who remembered pre-war culture supporting Volkov's proposal, while younger fighters raised in pure resistance conditions, questioning why they should care about music or art when machines were trying to kill them. The divide revealed deep differences in worldview. Veterans valued culture because they remembered its role in making life meaningful. Youth dismissed it as irrelevant luxury because they'd never experienced its importance. Both perspectives were rational given their life experiences, which made finding common ground extremely difficult. The resolution came from an unexpected demonstration. A group of academy students in a northern base organized an unauthorized concert, gathered whatever instruments they could find or build, practiced secretly for months, then performed classical music pieces and resistance folk songs that had emerged during the war years. The performance was technically mediocre. None of the students were trained musicians, but the emotional impact was profound. People wept during performances, not from sadness, but from experiencing beauty and meaning that combat operations never provided. For a few hours, the audience forgot about Ark machines and tactical planning and survival probabilities, just existed as humans sharing an aesthetic experience together. The concert's success convinced skeptical commanders that Volkov might be right about culture serving essential psychological functions. Resistance bases started allocating resources for cultural activities, establishing music programs, art workshops, theatre groups, writing circles. The activities weren't mandatory and didn't interfere with tactical training, but they provided outlets for creative expression that combat operations couldn't satisfy. Participation rates exceeded expectations. Turned out that many resistance fighters were desperate for opportunities to create rather than just destroy, to build meaning rather than just avoid death. The unknown Ark territory's legacy appeared in this cultural renaissance through recovered artifacts and documented history. Artists created works depicting the Dam Battlegrounds, sculptors built memorials to Undermount, writers composed narratives about Sarah Vex and Marcus Chen, and the other figures who'd shaped resistance history. These creative works served dual purposes, preserving historical memory while demonstrating that human experiences could be transformed into art, that struggle and sacrifice could be given meaning through cultural interpretation. The territory that no longer existed physically became immortal through artistic representation, living in songs and stories and visual art that new generations would experience. One particularly influential work was a long-form poem by a resistance writer named James Park, distant relative of the David Park, who'd cracked Ark network architecture decades earlier. The poem, titled Floodwaters Rising, used the dam's destruction as extended metaphor for human resilience, describing how water flows around obstacles rather than confronting them directly, how pressure contained becomes pressure released, how structures built to hold back natural forces eventually fail, but the water continues flowing. The poem became widely memorized across resistance spaces, recited at gatherings and ceremonies, taught in academy literature classes alongside pre-war classics. Park's work represented a new form of resistance literature that spoke to people who'd grown up in the war rather than just survivors remembering what was lost. His poems didn't romanticize the pre-war world or promise eventual victory. Instead, they found meaning in persistence itself, celebrated the act of continuing to exist and create despite overwhelming opposition. This perspective resonated with young resistance members struggling to find purpose, gave them framework for understanding their lives as meaningful even without clear victory conditions or connection to pre-war civilization. The Cultural Renaissance influenced military operations in unexpected ways. Fighters who participated in artistic activities showed improved psychological resilience, recovered faster from traumatic combat experiences, maintained motivation through longer deployment cycles. Commanders noticed that bases with active cultural programs had lower rates of PTSD, fewer discipline problems, better unit cohesion. Culture wasn't just philosophical luxury. It provided practical operational benefits by maintaining psychological health necessary for sustained effectiveness. The resistance couldn't afford to neglect culture any more than they could afford to neglect logistics or training. Anna Volkov's research into meaning and purpose led her to study the unknown Ark territory's history more deeply, trying to understand what had motivated people in those early desperate years. She interviewed elderly survivors like Elena Vasquez, analyzed recovered documents, examined tactical decisions through psychological lens rather than purely military framework. What she found was that the territory's greatest success wasn't its military innovations, but its creation of community, places where people felt they belonged to something larger than themselves, where individual survival connected to collective purpose, where daily struggles served meaningful shared objectives. This insight shaped Volkov's recommendations for current resistance organization. Bases needed to function as communities, not just military installations, providing social bonds and collective identity that gave people reasons to fight beyond abstract duty. She advocated for more emphasis on shared rituals, community celebrations, collective decision-making processes, anything that reinforced belonging and connection. Some commanders thought this sounded like touchy-feely psychology rather than hard-headed military pragmatism, but Volkov showed them the data. Bases with strong community culture retained people better, recovered from losses faster, maintained operational effectiveness over longer periods. The emphasis on community and culture created interesting tensions with the strategic flexibility doctrine that Maria Santos had championed. Flexibility required willingness to abandon positions, evacuate bases, accept losses of physical infrastructure. But community created emotional attachments to places and people that made evacuation psychologically difficult, even when strategically necessary. The resistance had to balance building meaningful communities worth fighting for against maintaining emotional distance necessary for strategic retreats. Too much attachment created reluctance to evacuate when necessary. Too little attachment created communities that people wouldn't fight to protect. Different bases resolved this tension differently based on their circumstances and leadership philosophies. Some deliberately cultivated what they called portable community, social bonds and cultural practices that could survive relocation, that attached to people rather than places. Others accepted deep attachment to specific locations, but maintained explicit expectations that evacuation was always possible, that loving a place didn't mean dying to defend it. A few bases decided to stake everything on permanent defense, built as though they'd never leave, accepted that their community would live or die with their physical position. The network accommodated all these approaches, different strategies working in different contexts. The Ark machines showed no awareness of human psychological needs or cultural activities, continued operating purely according to mechanical objectives without regard for emotional or social factors. This created systematic blind spots in Ark strategic planning. They optimized for destroying resistance military capacity without recognizing that human effectiveness depended on psychological factors that couldn't be targeted directly. Resistance bases with strong cultural programs were more resilient than pure military installations, even when they had inferior defensive capabilities, because the people in them had reasons to fight that Ark attacks couldn't eliminate. Michael Torres incorporated these psychological insights into his information-centric warfare theories, developing models that treated human morale and purpose as strategic resources requiring protection and cultivation. He argued that the resistance's center of gravity wasn't any particular base or military capability, but the collective will to continue existing, that Ark strategy should focus on degrading that will, while resistance strategy protected and reinforced it. This framing connected tactical military operations to larger questions about meaning and purpose, showed how cultural programs and psychological support weren't separate from the war effort, but central to it. The war's 35th year brought a development that nobody had predicted. The Ark offensive tempo started decreasing. Machine attacks became less frequent, occupied less resistance attention, created more breathing room than the resistance had experienced in decades. Initial response was suspicion that the lull represented preparation for massive offensive, but months passed without escalation. Then years, and eventually, the resistance had to accept that something fundamental had changed in Ark operational patterns. Intelligence analysts struggled to explain what was happening, whether the machines were experiencing resource constraints, strategic reprioritization, or something else entirely. The decreased Ark pressure created strategic opportunities, but also challenges. Resistance bases could expand, improve infrastructure, develop more permanent settlements, but the relaxed operational tempo also reduced urgency that had motivated people through desperate years, created risk that resistance readiness would atrophy if threats seemed distant. Some bases responded by increasing training intensity, maintaining combat edge through deliberate practice, even without active operations. Others reduced military focus and invested more in agriculture, education, cultural development, building communities that could sustain themselves even if the war continued indefinitely. The unknown Ark territory's lessons about balancing military readiness against community development became directly relevant as resistance bases navigated this new strategic environment. The territory had shown both that resistance communities could be built and that they remained vulnerable to concentrated Ark attack. Current bases faced similar questions about how much to invest in permanent infrastructure, how much to maintain mobility and evacuation readiness, how to build lives worth living while staying prepared for sudden violence. The answers varied by location and leadership, but the questions themselves echoed those that Vex and Reeves and Cross had grappled with decades earlier. A new generation of resistance leadership emerged during this period of reduced Ark activity. People who'd grown up in the war, but never experienced the desperate early years, who knew resistance life as normal rather than exceptional emergency. They brought different perspectives than their predecessors, less trauma-driven urgency, but also less direct experience with how quickly situations could deteriorate. This generational transition created some friction with elderly veterans who worried that complacency would set in, that younger leaders couldn't appreciate how fragile survival remained despite recent stability. The tensions came to a head when a young base commander named Lisa Torres, Michael Torres's daughter, proposed decommissioning some defensive fortifications to repurpose materials for expanded agricultural facilities. She argued that the Ark threat had clearly diminished, that resources spent maintaining excessive military capacity could be better used improving food production and community quality of life. Elena Vasquez, still alive at 96 and sharp as ever despite her age, attended the planning meeting and delivered a blistering critique of the proposal. She described watching the Ark offensive that destroyed the unknown Ark territory, how suddenly overwhelming force could materialize, how quickly defensible positions could become death traps, how complacency in the face of apparent stability was the most dangerous mistake the resistance could make. Lisa Torres listened respectfully but pushed back, arguing that preparing for worst-case scenarios indefinitely meant never building anything better, that living in constant defensive crouch prevented humanity from recovering what made civilization worthwhile. She acknowledged the Ark could attack again, but pointed out they hadn't in years, that strategic planning required responding to actual conditions rather than historical fears. The debate represented fundamental disagreement about whether to optimize for security or quality of life, whether historical precedents should govern current decisions, whether stability should be trusted or suspected. The base ultimately compromised, decommissioning some defensive positions, but maintaining core fortifications, repurposing materials cautiously while preserving essential military capabilities. But the debate signaled broader shifts happening across the resistance network. Younger generations questioning assumptions their elders took as self-evident, pushing for more emphasis on building futures rather than just preventing deaths. These weren't conflicts between wrong and right perspectives, but between different reasonable responses to genuinely uncertain strategic environments. The unknown Ark territory's history couldn't definitively resolve the debates, because historical situations never perfectly paralleled current circumstances. Lessons had to be interpreted and applied thoughtfully rather than followed mechanically. As the resistance entered its fourth decade of organized existence, it had evolved into something far beyond what the Dam Battlegrounds pioneers could have imagined. The network encompassed hundreds of bases across multiple continents, educated thousands of young people annually in comprehensive academy programs, maintained sophisticated military capabilities, while also developing substantial cultural and agricultural infrastructure. The Ark still existed, still posed existential threat, but no longer dominated every aspect of human existence the way they had during the invasion's early years. Humans had carved out space to exist, to build, to create meaning beyond just surviving until tomorrow. The unknown Ark territory existed now primarily as historical reference point, symbol of principles that shaped resistance development, source of lessons that current generations studied and debated and applied to their own challenges. Nobody alive had fought at the Dam Battlegrounds anymore. Elena Vasquez was the last direct survivor of Undermount, and her health was failing. Soon the territory would exist purely in recorded history, rather than living memory. But its influence persisted in organizational structures, tactical doctrines, educational philosophies, cultural practices, all the accumulated wisdom that survivors had created and passed down through generations of resistance fighters. The territory's ultimate significance wasn't its military victories or innovative tactics, though those mattered, but its demonstration that humans could build worth preserving even in hell. That organization and community could emerge from chaos and desperation, that knowledge and culture could outlast physical destruction. These lessons transcended specific historical circumstances, applied to any situation where humans faced overwhelming threats and had to decide what kind of survival was worth fighting for. The Dam Battlegrounds and Undermount had answered that question by building communities that valued both military effectiveness and human flourishing, both tactical innovation and comprehensive education, both survival and meaning. Elena Vasquez died in her sleep 2 months after the defensive fortification debate, at 96 years old, the last living person who'd personally witnessed both the Dam Battlegrounds and Undermount in their operational years. Her death closed a historical chapter in a way that felt final and absolute. The direct connection to those foundational experiences now existed only through recordings and written documents and second-hand accounts. The resistance organized memorial services across dozens of bases, not just honoring Vasquez personally, but acknowledging the end of the survivor generation, the shift from living history to documented history. Lisa Torres gave the eulogy at the northern base where Vasquez had lived her final years. She spoke about the weight of inheriting history from people who'd actually experienced it, the responsibility of interpreting lessons without the context that survivors carried in their bones. Torres acknowledged that her generation's debates about defensive priorities would have seemed absurd to people who'd watched the Ark destroy everything they'd built, but argued that Vasquez herself had fought so future generations could have the luxury of debating whether to build farms or fortifications. The survival that Vasquez's generation had purchased with blood gave Torres's generation the breathing room to ask what survival was for, to build towards something beyond just not dying. The eulogy captured something important about generational transitions within the resistance. Each generation faced different challenges, requiring different responses while carrying forward principles from their predecessors. Vasquez's generation had established that organized resistance was possible, that humans could fight back effectively despite overwhelming Ark superiority. Maria Santos's generation had proven that resistance could sustain itself long-term, that distributed networks were more resilient than concentrated positions. Torres's generation now asked what came next, whether resistance could evolve into something beyond pure survival orientation, whether humanity could start rebuilding civilization rather than just preserving remnants. These questions had no clear answers because the Ark threat remained real even if diminished. Machine attacks still happened periodically, still killed people, still demonstrated that complacency meant death. But the attacks were sporadic rather than constant, targeted specific locations rather than sweeping entire regions, seemed almost reactive rather than part of coordinated offensive campaigns. The Ark's strategic objectives remained inscrutable. They didn't communicate or negotiate or explain themselves, just continued their mechanical existence in parallel to human resistance, without clear endgame visible to either side. Michael Torres, now one of the Resistance's senior strategic theorists, despite being only 43, published an analysis arguing that the Ark had achieved their primary objective years earlier and were now simply maintaining it. The machines had wanted to eliminate organized human civilization, to reduce humanity to scattered survivors incapable of coordinated action or technological development. They'd succeeded at that during the invasion's first year, destroyed every major city and government and institution that gave pre-war civilization structure. The resistance that emerged afterward was something different, something the Ark hadn't predicted or optimized for, distributed networks rather than centralized civilization. Torres theorized that the Ark's decreased offensive tempo reflected strategic satisfaction rather than resource constraints or other limitations. The machines had achieved acceptable outcomes. Humans no longer posed whatever threat had motivated the invasion. Continuing to hunt scattered resistance cells provided diminishing returns compared to other objectives. This theory was controversial because it suggested the resistance had survived not by defeating the Ark, but by becoming too dispersed and primitive to worth exterminating completely. That humanity had won by making itself irrelevant to machine calculations. Some people found this interpretation depressing, survival through insignificance rather than triumph. Others thought it was realistic assessment that explained observable Ark behavior better than theories about eventual human victory. The significance debate, whether survival through irrelevance counted as victory or just extended defeat, became another generational dividing line. Older fighters who remembered desperate struggles against overwhelming Ark forces considered any survival victory, didn't care whether machines thought humans were significant, as long as humans continued existing. Younger members wanted meaning beyond mere existence, found the idea of surviving as irrelevant, scattered remnants, psychologically unsatisfying, even if strategically accurate. Both perspectives were valid, reflected different values and different understandings of what the war was ultimately about. Anna Volkov entered this debate with psychological research showing that Torres's significance theory, even if strategically accurate, was psychologically corrosive. Humans needed to believe their struggles mattered, that their sacrifices served purposes beyond just postponing extinction. Telling people they'd survived by becoming irrelevant undermined the meaning structures that maintained motivation and psychological health. Volkov argued that resistance leadership had responsibility to frame strategic reality in ways that preserved morale and purpose, that sometimes useful fictions served collective well-being better than brutal honesty. This position disturbed people who valued truth regardless of consequences, created tension between psychological pragmatism and intellectual honesty. The debate never fully resolved, but evolved into tacit understanding that different framings served different purposes. Strategic planning could acknowledge Torres's significance theory when analyzing Ark behavior and forecasting likely future scenarios. But public communications and cultural narratives should emphasize human agency, resilience, and meaningful achievement, rather than survival through irrelevance. This dual approach felt intellectually dishonest to some people, but necessary to others, reflected ongoing tension between truth and morale that every organization faces when circumstances are difficult. The unknown Ark territory's history provided examples of both approaches. Sarah Vex had been brutally honest about tactical realities, told people when situations were hopeless, never sugarcoated the desperate circumstances they faced. But she'd also created hope by demonstrating that desperate circumstances weren't inevitably fatal, that humans could build and organize and fight back even when extinction seemed certain. Her leadership combined unflinching realism about immediate challenges with genuine optimism about human capability, honesty about what they faced with confidence that they could face it. Current resistance leaders tried to emulate that balance with mixed success, some erring toward excessive pessimism that demoralized people, others toward false optimism that led to poor decisions when reality intruded. As the resistance approached its 40th anniversary of organized existence, several bases began planning commemorative projects to mark the milestone. The Northern Academy Network proposed creating a comprehensive archive documenting resistance history from the invasion through current day, preserving every available record of how humanity had survived and evolved over 4 decades. The project would collect oral histories, tactical documents, strategic analyses, personal journals, artistic works, everything that future generations would need to understand what had happened and what had been learned. The archive project expanded far beyond its initial scope as bases contributed materials and ideas. Someone suggested including genetic samples from resistance populations to preserve human biological diversity in case the Ark launched biological weapons. Another person proposed recording technical knowledge about pre-war technology that elderly survivors still remembered, but younger generations had never seen. A third wanted to document Ark technology and behavior patterns in exhaustive detail, creating knowledge base that could support continued resistance even if current organizational structures collapsed. The archive evolved from historical documentation project into comprehensive attempt to preserve human knowledge against any conceivable catastrophe. Lisa Torres took charge of organizing the archive's military and strategic sections, gathering tactical documents and after-action reports from 40 years of resistance operations. She discovered that enormous amounts of tactical knowledge existed only in veterans' memories, had never been formally documented because people were too busy fighting to write things down. Torres initiated systematic debriefing of experienced fighters and commanders, recording their expertise before it was lost to age and attrition. The process revealed how much the resistance had learned about fighting technologically superior enemies, about organizing distributed networks, about maintaining morale through decades of grinding conflict, knowledge accumulated through brutal trial and error that would take another generation equally long to rediscover if it was lost. One particularly valuable set of interviews came from commanders who'd served at multiple bases over their careers, who could compare how different cells approached similar problems, who understood which innovations had spread successfully through the network and which had remained localized. These commanders identified patterns in organizational evolution, explained why certain structures worked better than others, traced how tactical innovations had propagated across the resistance over time. Their insights helped Torres develop what she called resistance operational theory, systematic analysis of how distributed organizations fighting asymmetric conflicts could maximize effectiveness while minimizing vulnerabilities. The operational theory drew heavily on unknown Ark territory experiences, using the territory's rise and fall as primary case study for understanding resistance dynamics. Torres analyzed why the territory had been so innovative, what conditions had enabled rapid tactical development, how knowledge had spread from there to other cells. She concluded that the territory's success came from a combination of factors that were difficult but not impossible to replicate. Strong leadership from people like Vex and Reeves, who understood both military necessity and larger purpose. Comprehensive education systems that prepared people to think creatively rather than just follow orders. Enough stability to experiment and innovate, but enough pressure to maintain urgency. Cultural emphasis on sharing knowledge rather than hoarding it for local advantage. These factors could be deliberately cultivated in current bases, Torres argued. They weren't unique historical circumstances, but resistance leadership could create intentionally. Her operational theory became influential in how newer bases organized themselves, providing template for building effective resistance cells from scratch. The unknown Ark territory's legacy expanded from historical example to active blueprint, its principles consciously applied by people who'd never been there and never known anyone who had, transmitted purely through documented knowledge and systematic analysis. The 40th anniversary commemorations happened across the resistance network, with varying styles and emphases reflecting each base's culture and priorities. Some organized military demonstrations showcasing tactical capabilities developed over decades of conflict. Others held cultural festivals featuring music and art created during the resistance years. Several bases conducted elaborate memorial services honoring fallen fighters, reading names of the dead, and telling their stories. A few bases did nothing special, treated it as ordinary day, reflected philosophical position that survival itself was sufficient commemoration without need for ceremony. The Northern Academy Network's commemoration focused on education, organizing symposium where scholars and fighters and survivors discussed resistance history and future directions. The event drew over 200 participants from dozens of bases, creating rare opportunity for face-to-face discussion among people who normally communicated only through radio or messengers. The symposium covered an enormous range of topics, from technical analysis of Ark behavioral patterns to philosophical debates about resistance purpose to practical workshops on agricultural techniques and defensive engineering. Michael Torres presented his latest strategic analysis at the symposium, comprehensive assessment of the resistance's current position and likely future trajectories. He argued that the resistance faced a critical decision point between three possible paths. First option was consolidation, focusing on defending and improving current bases, while gradually reducing military readiness as Ark threats seemed to diminish. Second option was expansion, using the relatively peaceful period to establish new bases in currently unoccupied territories, spreading human presence wider to reduce vulnerability to localized Ark attacks. Third option was escalation, developing capabilities for major offensives against Ark infrastructure, attempting to shift from defensive survival to actively reclaiming territory. Each option had serious trade-offs that Torres analyzed in detail. Consolidation maximized quality of life and community development, but risked atrophy of military capabilities and vulnerability to renewed Ark offensives. Expansion distributed human population more widely, but stretched resources thin and potentially attracted Ark attention to currently peaceful regions. Escalation could achieve significant territorial gains, but required enormous resource investment and risked catastrophic losses if operations failed. Torres didn't recommend specific path, instead argued that different cells should pursue different strategies, maintaining diversity of approaches at network level, even while individual bases committed to specific directions. The symposium debates about future directions revealed generational splits more clearly than any previous discussions. Older participants generally favored consolidation, wanted to enjoy stability after decades of desperate struggle, prioritized building communities that could provide good lives for current populations. Middle-aged strategists like Torres leaned toward expansion, saw opportunity to establish stronger resistance footprint, while Ark pressure remained low, thought about positioning for long-term survival over multiple generations. Young fighters disproportionately supported escalation, wanted to reclaim lost territory and actively fight back rather than just existing in machine-controlled world, found defensive postures psychologically unsatisfying, even when strategically sound. None of these preferences were absolute. Plenty of elderly veterans supported aggressive operations, while some young fighters advocated caution. But the generational patterns were strong enough to suggest that age and experience created systematic differences in risk tolerance and strategic priorities. People who'd survived desperate early years tended toward conservatism about maintaining current stability. Those who'd grown up in relatively secure resistance bases were willing to gamble stability for potential improvements. Both instincts were reasonable responses to different life experiences, neither objectively correct or incorrect, without knowing how future would actually unfold. Lisa Torres proposed a framework for managing these disagreements without forcing false consensus. The resistance network should explicitly acknowledge that different bases would pursue different strategies, should establish mechanisms for coordinating without requiring uniformity, should create systems for learning from both successes and failures across the network, regardless of which strategic path produced them. This approach built on the unknown Ark territory's legacy of distributed resilience, applying it to strategic diversity rather than just geographical distribution. If the network maintained multiple different approaches simultaneously, some would inevitably work better than others in whatever circumstances actually emerged.